Hi, and welcome to episode 3 of the Western Canon Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Alexander Hill, and today we'll be discussing Homer's epic poem, the Odyssey. Hi, and welcome again to the Western Canon Podcast. This is a podcast devoted to reading, analyzing, and discussing the great works of the Western literary tradition. On today's show, we'll be discussing Homer's Odyssey. Now, because the Odyssey is so thematically rich and so complex, we'll be examining the Odyssey in two parts. In this episode, part 1, I'll give a brief summary of the general plot. That is, I'll try to give listeners a basic gist of the story, although there is no substitute for just putting down that cell phone, cracking open a copy of the Odyssey and sitting down in a quiet room with it. The Odyssey is amazingly readable, and certainly even for English speakers, there are many great translations of the Odyssey. So this episode will do a summary, and we'll have on two excellent guests. For part 2 of the Odyssey, that will be next episode, we'll be discussing the themes and the influence that the Odyssey has had on later writers and on culture. We'll be discussing those themes in great depth. But we have a great show for you today. Joining us this episode, we have one of the great rock stars of the classics world. New Yorker writer and best-selling author Daniel Mendelsohn will be joining us. He'll be talking with us about Homer's Odyssey, obviously, and his fantastic new book, An Odyssey, a father, a son, and an epic. We'll also be joined by one of my favorite thinkers, philosophy professor and author Stephen Hicks. He is author of the book Explaining Postmodernism, among other books. So let's jump right into the Odyssey, starting with a brief summary. So the Odyssey is about the long, arduous, 10-year homeward journey of the wily and complex Greek hero Odysseus, who faces many obstacles, including monsters, temptresses, and the vengeful wrath of the sea god Poseidon, so that he can return home to his beloved family in Ithaca. Now, one unique thing about Homer's Odyssey is that it's not just a story about a manly man's hero's journey, but it's also about the lives of the desperate family members that he leaves behind and their struggle to carry on in his absence. So let's start at the beginning of the Odyssey. It is perhaps appropriate to start our discussion with a reminder that the poem assumes its audience is familiar with the Iliad and the events that take place after the Iliad. So that is to say, the details of the Trojan War, the death of Achilles, the sack of Troy. These are some of the things that take place in the Iliad, but also some of the things that the Iliad doesn't cover. There's also the story in the Little Iliad, as it's known, of how the Greeks built the great wooden horse, which allowed them to penetrate the walls of Troy surreptitiously and sack Troy at night. Many people don't realize that the famous Trojan horse was actually Odysseus's invention. He came up with the idea. So that's a mark of his intelligence. Okay then, who is Odysseus as a character? You'll probably remember how instrumental Odysseus was to the Greeks, even at their most dire moments. He was considered the smart one, right? The smart, persuasive, talented orator. He was even sent to the champion Achilles in the Greeks' greatest hour of need when they needed to convince Achilles to return to fighting. Agamemnon said, if anyone can convince Achilles, Odysseus can. So Odysseus was even a great fighter in many hectic moments of battle, but especially in Book 11 of the Iliad, Odysseus actually shows himself to be an impressive fighter. He takes on droves of soldiers and fights back to back with the giant warrior Aias. So that's Odysseus. Now for the story in the Odyssey. Like the Iliad, the Odyssey begins in medias res, that is, in the middle of its subject matter. Homer starts with an introduction, we call this a proeme, that occupies readers for the first 10 lines of the poem. The proem's job in Homeric epic is to set the scene, to let the audience know what the bard's going to be talking about, how the story will start, who it will be about, and what has happened leading up to the events that will take place in the story. So in this episode, I'm going to be using the Richmond Lattimore translation of Homer, just so you know. And here's the Richmond Lattimore translation of Homer's proeme in the Odyssey. Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways, who was driven far journeys after he had sacked Troy's sacred citadel. Many were they whose cities he saw, whose minds he learned of, many the pains he suffered in his spirit on the wide sea, struggling for his own life and the homecoming of his companions. Even so, he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to. They were destroyed by their own wild recklessness. Fools who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the day of their homecoming. From some point here, goddess, daughter of Zeus, speak and begin our story. So what do we learn from the proem? Well, notice that Odysseus is actually given credit for sacking the city of Troy. He's being regarded in this proem as a hero right at the outset. And notice also the repetition on and the focus on homecoming. The bard makes it clear at the outset that this will be a story of Odysseus' journey home to his native land of Ithaca. Also notice that Odysseus is called the man of many ways. This is translated from the Greek word polytropos. The word polytropos really has two meanings. In one sense, Odysseus is literally a man of many ways. Consider Odysseus' journey. On his way home, he is tossed to and fro, back and forth. He's turned around. He's blown off course. He's captured, and he's caught up constantly during his journey back home. So in one sense, polytropos refers to Odysseus' kind of wayward wanderings. But in another sense, if you think about Odysseus' character, polytropos also refers to his mind, to his cleverness. He is literally polytropos in his mind. He's able to strategize and get out of even the most difficult situations. His mind is agile and calculating. And because of his agile mind, this also allows him to be many-skilled. Polytropos, he can fight, he can think, he can be, when he wants to, quite diplomatic. So we have to ask then, what is Odysseus striving for in this epic? In line 13, just after the proem, it's made clear that Odysseus' journey is motivated by two desires, his wife and his home. And I think it's important to note in that order, the lines read, quote, "All the others were at home now, having escaped the sea and the fighting. This one alone," referring to Odysseus here, "this one alone, longing for his wife and his homecoming. However, he was, quote, detained by the queenly nymph Calypso, bright among goddesses, desiring that he, Odysseus, should be her husband." Now, before we get to talking about these scenes, to understand how a story like this is conceptualized, we kind of have to look at the two different types of epic. Scholars say ancient epics can be divided into two different types. As I mentioned in episode 2, the Iliad episode, there is kleos epic, that is epic of glory or warfare. This is embodied by the Iliad. And then there is nostos epic. These are epics of the hero's homecoming and the adventures and troubles he must go through in the act of returning home. This is obviously the type of epic that the Odyssey is. Now, the story itself begins 20 years after Odysseus left to fight in the Trojan War. So this is the 10th year after the Trojan War. The war is long over, and our magnificent hero is stuck out at sea. As the story makes clear, everyone else has made it back. They've either made it home or died, but Odysseus is the only one still missing. It turns out he's being held captive by the nymph Calypso on the island of Ogygia. In Book 1, when the Odyssey opens, Athena, and this is the goddess of wisdom and war and justice and law, it's also worth mentioning here that Athena is one big reason why Odysseus has made it as far as he has in the first place. She's always helping him out. Throughout the story, she manipulates the characters and the events of the Odyssey to help Odysseus along. Athena begs her father Zeus, again, Zeus is the king of the gods, so Athena begs her father to send the messenger god Hermes to tell this devious nymph Calypso that she's got to let Odysseus go. She tells Zeus that Odysseus, quote, is suffering griefs on the sea-washed island, the navel of all the waters, a wooded island. There a goddess has made her dwelling place. She is the daughter of malignant Atlas. She detains the grieving, unhappy man, and ever with soft and flattering words she works to charm him to forget Ithaca. Odysseus longs to die." Unquote. But now we have a subtle plot twist. Just when we think the narrative is going to show Zeus sending Hermes to Calypso's island and Odysseus returning to Ithaca, living happily ever after, the narrative switches and goes off on a side story. So while Zeus is sending Hermes to help Odysseus, Athena goes to Ithaca to see Odysseus' son, Telemachus, because Telemachus is in real trouble. Interestingly enough, the first 4 books of the Odyssey don't involve Odysseus at all, but it spends the entire time following the adventures of his son Telemachus. In books 1 and 2 of the Odyssey, we learn about Telemachus. We see Telemachus at home on his island of Ithaca, and things are not going well. Odysseus has been gone now for 20 years, and in his absence, things are in horrible disarray. What does this mean? Well, Odysseus' beautiful wife Penelope is being courted by a great horde of suitors. And these suitors assume, obviously, that Odysseus is long dead. The suitors are consuming the island's resources. They're killing Odysseus' livestock. They're pressuring Penelope. Penelope, actually, we should stop to note, Penelope is in a difficult situation. She is caught between 2 conflicting duties with no way of knowing which one she should follow. I mean, if she's still a wife, it is Penelope's absolute, unquestioned duty to stay loyal to her husband at this time. If Odysseus is still alive, Penelope must maintain his household. She's got to take care of his goods and his family, and she cannot remarry. At the same time, this is a culture and a time period that has no place for an unmarried woman. Penelope needs to be married. There is no role in this society for an independent unmarried woman. She can't have a career, she can't have it all, etc. So here's the pickle she's in. If Odysseus is still alive, Penelope's absolute unquestioned duty is to remain loyal to him. On the other hand, if he's dead, since again, there's no place for a single woman in this society, she has just as much of a duty to get remarried and to turn her husband's household over to her son Telemachus. So what should Penelope do? Is she a wife or is she a widow? This is Penelope's dilemma in the story, okay? Meanwhile, Odysseus' son Telemachus, who has never met his father, he is also confused about his status. Is he guarding his father's house and kingdom? Should he be waiting for his father to come back? Or is Ithaca his kingdom now, right? He doesn't know. And he also doesn't know how to act because he's never had a father to teach him how to be a man. Should he be trying to claim his home and his kingdom as an independent grown man? How would he do that? He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know if his father's still alive. Now, beyond the family, another thing to note here is that the kingdom of Ithaca, the society itself, is also in disarray. Like all societies portrayed in Homeric epics, Ithaca is a monarchy. As the classics scholar Elizabeth Vandiver points out, quote, "It seems never to have occurred to anyone on Ithaca that you could have any form of society other than a monarchy. Ithaca, therefore, is a monarchy whose monarch has been missing for 20 years. And the disorder this causes in society is vast." Now, the biggest cause of this disorder is the over 100 suitors that I mentioned before who are trying to persuade Penelope that her husband is dead and that she should marry one of them. The suitors are mostly young men who are growing increasingly impatient without a king. And remember, they're not only trying to marry Penelope, because they like her, but they're hoping really to take over Odysseus' household, to take possession of Telemachus' inheritance, and to rule Ithaca. So part of what they want is power. Telemachus himself, who remember has been raised without a father, isn't able to assert himself properly as a man. He's not able to handle the suitors. So Homer at the outset of this story sets up the story beautifully with this tension, this suspense, this high drama. The situation in Ithaca is coming to a head, and we're wondering as readers if Odysseus will ever return. And if he isn't returning, we're wondering, what is Telemachus going to do? Will Telemachus act? Now, you got to realize the suitors in this story have basically taken over Odysseus's home in his absence, and the only thing Telemachus seems to be able to do is watch, right? There are so many suitors, and he doesn't know how to handle this situation. All he can do is sit back and watch in horror. They are pressuring Penelope. They are getting drunk. They're eating all of Odysseus's food. They're forcing his servants to wait on them. Something has got to give. Something must be done. Okay, at this point, we should go back to our old buddy, the goddess Athena, who sees what's going on and leaps into action. She says, not only is it important to get Odysseus back home, but we got to fix this situation on Ithaca. So she disguises herself as an old war buddy of Odysseus's, and she goes to Ithaca to advise Telemachus, this inexperienced Telemachus. She goes there and she tells Telemachus to call the islanders to an assembly. Right? If Telemachus can't be a man, Athena is going to come down and help him. So she tells Telemachus, here's my advice, Telemachus. You got to call the islanders to an assembly, call the suitors to an assembly, invoke the gods, call on the suitors to disperse, and assert yourself. And she says, then this is what you do. When you're done doing that, you got to set sail abroad. You need to go out in search of your father, right? She tells him first to sail to Pylos, that's an island, and then to Sparta to seek out news of his father, Odysseus, right? Go out, get in touch with these people, and see if they have any idea what happened to Odysseus. So in books 3 and 4, then, Telemachus is going out in search of his father. Encouraged by Athena, he sails to see King Nestor at Pylos and also the red-haired King Menelaus of Sparta. These are two of Odysseus's warrior pals. If you remember, these guys are both in the Iliad. So Telemachus sets out to rescue his father. Now, King Nestor of Pylos is certainly happy to see Telemachus, but he says he can't give him any information regarding the whereabouts of his father, although he does tell Telemachus the story of Agamemnon's homecoming. When Agamemnon, who was if you remember, the leader of the Greek siege of Troy, when he returns home, he was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. Although his death was eventually avenged by his son Orestes. This whole event, I should mention, is documented in the Oresteia. That's a tragedy by the Greek tragedian Aeschylus, who will be the subject of one of our upcoming episodes. So Telemachus goes next to visit King Menelaus of Sparta. If you remember, Menelaus is the husband of Helen and the brother of Agamemnon. Menelaus reports to Telemachus that he learned from the sea god Proteus, also known as the Old Man of the Sea. Proteus is basically a servant of Poseidon. Menelaus reports that Odysseus is alive, and actually he knows his whereabouts. He's alive on the island of Ogygia, and he's being held there captive by the nymph Calypso for her own pleasure. He's basically her sex slave. While all of this is happening, while Telemachus is out learning about his father, when he is out in search of his father, the suitors back on Ithaca are so angered and alarmed at this newfound confidence of Telemachus, this new enterprising journey of his to find his father, that they decide to hatch a plot to murder him on his way home, to murder Telemachus. Now, in books 5 through 8, we take up with Odysseus really for the first time, as Hermes, the messenger god, shows up to save him from Calypso's island. Now remember, Athena begged Zeus to send Hermes to free Odysseus. Now, Odysseus is allowed to return home. Calypso is not happy about this, but she certainly can't defy the will of Zeus. Now, interestingly enough, this is the first shot in this moment. This is the first shot that we get of Odysseus, our hero. And what is he doing? He's actually crying, right? In this first moment that we see Odysseus, he is crying. Remember, Odysseus has been held as a solitary prisoner for 7 years. So he's probably not in very good shape. He's basically Calypso's sex slave on this island. And here he is, our first view of him He's looking out over the ocean, longing for home, longing for Ithaca, and he's crying. It's not very heroic, or at least it doesn't seem so from our perspective. And we're told that he does this every day, that he's always crying. He's been stuck on this island for 7 years. All of his companions, all of the men who went to Troy with him, have been long lost, and he's being held captive. There's nothing he can do. And we get the sense that not only is Odysseus being in a sense, hidden, held back from his wife, from his son, from his home, from his friends. He's also being held back from himself. I mean, remember, Odysseus is known as the man of many turnings. He's witty, he's intelligent, he's a good speaker, he's tricky, he's full of life, and he's a formidable warrior. And yet on this island, Odysseus is essentially passive, right? He's completely unlike his true self while he's on Calypso's island. She's got complete control over him. In fact, Calypso's name actually means I shall hide or I shall conceal, right? So in a sense, Calypso is not only concealing or hiding Odysseus from the world, from his family, but she's hiding Odysseus from his true self. On this island, if you think about it, Odysseus is kind of stuck. He's not able to plan a course of action. He's not able to act with agency in any real sense. He's not able to do any of the things that we would say gives life meaning. And so on Calypso's island, he is stuck in a kind of limbo, and he's depressed. So Calypso is now forced to let Odysseus go. And it's funny, even after Hermes tells her to let Odysseus go, Calypso makes one last pitch to Odysseus. She promises that if he stays, look, if you stay, I'll make you immortal. She'll make him a god, in effect, which, if you think about it, kind of implies that if Odysseus had wanted to stay, right, if he responded in the affirmative, the gods would have been fine with it. So it's almost implied that the whole reason it's urgent to get him off of this island is that there's something wrong about this, that he's being held against his will, right? If he wanted to stay, we get the sense that the gods would have been fine with it. Now, in my opinion, this is one of the most romantic moments in all of Western literature. Odysseus, to Calypso's offer, flat out says no. He wishes to be immortal. He would rather return home as a human and resume his life than stay on this island with Calypso and be immortal. But clever as he is, Odysseus doesn't say it quite in this way. So after sleeping with Calypso one last time, he says, "Look, I feel the need to go home. I have to go home." He doesn't say, "I have to return to my wife. She's much more beautiful than you. I love her more." He says, I have to go home, right? I miss home. So after sleeping with Calypso one last time, Odysseus builds a raft, and he is allowed to journey to travel to the land of a people called the Phaeacians. There are difficulties on the way, however. See, when Poseidon realizes Odysseus has been let free, he whips up a terrible storm. So what happens to Odysseus? Well, luckily Odysseus is saved, as always, by a goddess of the sea called Leucothea, who helps him reach the shore of Scheria, a kingdom with a walled city, shrines, and houses, beyond which lay long stretches of fields. Scheria turns out to be the home of the Phaeacians. So Odysseus passes out, weary and naked, on the shores of Scheria. Now the ruler of the Phaeacians was a man called Alcinous. His daughter, a beautiful princess, was named Nausicaa. The next morning, Nausicaa and her maidens are down by the river washing their clothes. They're bathing themselves, they're rubbing oil on each other. Not bad, huh? And this is when their voices awaken the sleeping Odysseus. So Odysseus hears them. He covers his privates with an olive branch, and he stumbles over to the women. The only one in the group who really isn't afraid of Odysseus, remember, Odysseus is like naked and he's bleary-eyed and he looks like a homeless person. The only one who isn't afraid of him is Nausicaa, who, quote, stood her ground and faced him. So Odysseus here knows that if he wants to be accepted as a guest and if he wants to receive help, he must show evidence that he's intelligent, that he's well-bred, that he's earnest. He's got to use that wily intelligence that he's so famous for. We'll talk next episode about the concept of xenia, which basically means hospitality. But Odysseus, what he decides to do is to flatter Nausicaa, telling her she has the beauty and the stature of Artemis, and that she fills him with awe. He tells her, quote, "The hard sorrow is on me. Yesterday on the 20th day I escaped the wine-blue sea. Until then the current and the tearing winds had swept me along from the island of Ogygia, and my fate has landed me here. Then have pity, O queen. You are the first I have come to after much suffering. There's no one else that I know of here among the people who hold this land and this city. Show me the way to the town and give me some rag to wrap me in. And then may the gods give you everything that your heart longs for. May they grant you a husband and a house and sweet agreement in all things. For nothing is better than this, more steadfast than when two people, a man and his wife, keep a harmonious household, a thing that brings much distress to the people who hate them, and pleasure to their well-wishers, and for them the best reputation." Unquote. To this, Nausicaa responds that since Odysseus is clearly a thoughtful, well-spoken, kind man, and because Zeus has clearly favored him by sending him to her shore, she says, quote, "Since it is our land and our city that you have come to, you shall not lack for clothing nor anything else of those gifts which should befall the unhappy suppliant on his arrival. And I will show you our town and tell you the name of our people. It is the Phaeacians who hold this territory and city, and I myself am the daughter of the great-hearted Alcinous, whose power and dominion are held by right." And here she turns to her cowering handmaidens. "Stand fast, girls. Where are you flying just because you have looked on a man? Do you think this is some enemy coming against us? This is a poor wanderer who has come to us. We must now take care of him, since all strangers and wanderers are sacred in the sight of Zeus, and the gift is a light and a dear one. So, my attendants, give some food and drink to the stranger and bathe him, where there is shelter from the wind, in the river." So Nausicaa brings Odysseus to her parents, the king and the queen of the Phaeacians, and Odysseus is made welcome by them. Their names are Alcinous and Arete. They give Odysseus wine and a great feast. Odysseus, meanwhile, is overwhelmed by the lavish opulence of their palace, of this magisterial palace. The walls are bronze. Gold and silver is everywhere, along with statues and seating built into the walls. The place is suffused with perfumes and fragrances. Even beyond the palace hall, Odysseus looks out and sees a bountiful orchard and vineyards, along with gardens, a courtyard, freshwater springs. During the feast, Odysseus begins to tell the story of his journey and his time held captive by Calypso. Then Alcinous says that they will help get Odysseus home, which is exactly what Odysseus wanted. So a bed is made for Odysseus, and in the morning he's greeted with athletic games in his honor, and a ship is prepared as an escort for Odysseus' journey home. While the crew and ship are prepared, Odysseus joins King Alcinous in the palace to listen to a bard sing about the Trojan War, which is very familiar to Odysseus because he fought in the Trojan War and was a sort of a famous hero in the Trojan War. The bard's song was coincidentally about Odysseus himself and his famous deeds during the Trojan War. This brings back memories, and Alcinous begs to hear the full story of Odysseus' travels. He wishes to know, and I quote, "Come now, tell me this, and give me an accurate answer. Where were you driven off course? What countries peopled by men you came to, the men themselves in their strong-founded cities, and which were savage and violent and without justice, and which were hospitable and with a godly mind for strangers? And tell me why you weep in your heart and make lamentation when you hear of Ilion." Ilion is Troy, by the way. And this question hangs in the air as we arrive at Book 9. So Homer leaves us hanging, but Books 9 through 12, then, and this is really the most famous section of the Odyssey, although I think that's just because there's a lot of action and fighting and adventure, monsters and murder. This section is actually a flashback section, as Odysseus is narrating in the first person the adventures he's been on. Now, this lasts 4 books and is often called The Great Wanderings. And it describes his journey from leaving Troy, once the Trojan War is over, up to arriving at Calypso's island, where he's trapped by Calypso. So he begins his story with the Greeks' departure from Troy. At the start, Odysseus tells how he and his 12 ships were driven off course by a storm sent by Zeus. And then the story, at this point, seems to enter the twilight zone, the Mediterranean Bermuda Triangle. Odysseus seems in a way to be leaving the world at this point of reality and entering a world of fantasy and marvels. Many people have said that the Odyssey is the first science fiction novel, and that's because on his journey, Odysseus encounters many alien-like creatures and discovers all of these odd marvels that he has to grapple with. The first odd encounter is with a group called the Lotus Eaters. The Lotus Eaters, unlike enemies Odysseus will encounter in the future, they seem to be mostly benign. They're like lethargic old hippies. They're friendly, they're peaceful, they're welcoming. What they do is offer Odysseus and his men flowers of the lotus plant. Now, when you eat these flowers, you're overcome with forgetfulness, with sleepiness and pleasure. Those of us who work for a living know the value of that. This is a pleasing diversion for Odysseus and all of his men, but it's a diversion nonetheless. Remember, Odysseus is on the hero's journey. He has no time to lay around and take drugs and think about the meaning of life. Many of Odysseus's men, however, don't feel the same way, and they don't want to leave. And Odysseus, at this point, literally has to drag some of his men away from this fleeting, sensual distraction. The next adventure Odysseus recounts is his encounter with what he calls the lawless, outrageous Cyclops. This is one of the great famous scenes in the Odyssey. The Cyclops' name is Polyphemus. Polyphemus is actually Poseidon's son. He kills and eats 6 of Odysseus' men. And I'll read an interesting quote that comes as Odysseus and his men are preparing to scope out this wooded island that Polyphemus lives on. Odysseus says to his men, quote, "Wait here while I go and find out about these people and learn what they are, whether they're savage and violent and without justice, or hospitable to strangers and with minds that are godly." He eventually concludes with the diagnosis that the Cyclopes, that's plural for Cyclops, that they put, quote, "all of their trust in immortal gods. They neither plow with their hands nor plant anything, but all grows for them without seed planting, without cultivation. It is Zeus's rain that waters it for them. These people have no institutions, no meetings for council. Rather, they make their habitations in caverns, hollowed among the peaks of the high mountains, and each one is the law for his own wives and children, and cares nothing about the others." Again, these scenes develop themes that we'll certainly talk about in our next episode. But for now, we should recount what happens with Odysseus and his men as they encounter Polyphemus, the Cyclops. Now, Odysseus and his men, once they arrive at the island, they encounter Polyphemus in the flesh, who is very angry. Polyphemus captures Odysseus and his men, and he takes them to his cave, his dark cave. Now, the Cyclops, Polyphemus, starts out by killing and eating 2 of Odysseus' men. He says he'll eat another 2 for breakfast and another 2 for supper, and so on. Now, Odysseus has to use his wits here. Here's where we actually realize how cunning and clever and polytropos Odysseus really is. He comes up with a plan. Now, he's stuck in this cave. There's very little that he can do, so he's got to be smart here. The Cyclops has rolled a boulder in front of the door, so Odysseus realizes he can't just kill the Cyclops. He can't just take a spear and stab the Cyclops to death, because then he'll be dead. The Cyclops will be dead, and he and his men will just be stuck in the cave with nobody to move the boulder. So what he needs to do is to injure the Cyclops, to, better yet, blind the Cyclops, so the Cyclops won't be able to see Odysseus and his men, and yet the Cyclops will still need to get out of the cave to get help once he's stabbed in the eye. So what he needs to do is blind the Cyclops so the Cyclops won't be able to see Odysseus and his men. And yet, the Cyclops will still need to get out of the cave for help. When he does seek help, he'll have to move this boulder that's trapping them in the cave away from the door. And at this point, Odysseus and his men can sneak out. So what Odysseus does is he gets Polyphemus drunk. But before getting him drunk, he tells Polyphemus that his name is Utus, which is a Greek name that sounds very much like the Greek word for nobody. This is key because when Polyphemus gets drunk and he's sleeping off his drunk, and Odysseus stabs him in his one eye, Odysseus realizes he may not just automatically open the door, but will likely call for help. This is exactly what the Cyclops does. Polyphemus calls out in terror and pain. He calls the other neighboring Cyclopes for help. When he does call out for help and his neighbors come back, they call back, "Who's hurting you?" Polyphemus says back, "Utus is hurting me," which the neighboring Cyclopes take to mean, "Nobody is hurting me." So the neighboring Cyclopes say, well, if nobody's hurting you and you're screaming, this must be some disease sent by the gods. Maybe you should pray to your father Poseidon to help you, they say to him, and they go away. So once this has happened, Odysseus and his men are able to escape. The one mistake, though, that Odysseus makes, and he's infamous for this, is that he can't resist, whether it's his pride or an attempt to secure his kleos, he cannot resist shouting on his way out, "Cyclops, if any mortal man asks you who it was who inflicted upon you this shameful blinding, tell him that you are blinded by Odysseus, sacker of cities. Laertes is his father, and he makes his home in Ithaca." At this, of course, Polyphemus, the Cyclops, curses Odysseus by calling out to his father Poseidon, "Grant that Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, who makes his home in Ithaca, may never reach that home. But if it is decided that he shall see his own people and come home to his strong-founded house and to his own country, let him come late, in bad case, with the loss of all his companions, in someone else's ship, and find troubles in his household," which is exactly what happens throughout the rest of his journey home, which I won't linger on, but I'll try to abridge as much as I can. Now, the next place that Odysseus and his companions journey to is the island of Aeolus, king of the winds. Aeolus is hospitable to Odysseus, and he gives him and his crew a parting gift of all the winds in the world tied up in a bag. He actually gives this bag to Odysseus and his men to sail with. So the great thing about this bag is that the one wind that Aeolus leaves out of the bag is the wind that Odysseus needs to get home. So all of the rest of the winds that could blow Odysseus and his men off course, those winds are tied up in this bag. So those winds are trapped, and Odysseus has the great fortune to have the one wind he needs blowing him home. So he'll arrive home very shortly, right? Wrong. Unfortunately, when Odysseus falls asleep on the journey, as men do, we must sleep, his men get curious and open the bag. They believe it contains gold and jewels, and they're curious, and they let the winds out. As a result, Odysseus and his men are blown all the way back to Aeolus's island. And when they get there, Aeolus is angry. He has no sympathy for Odysseus. He says, "Look, if you couldn't even make it back home when I did this for you, then that must mean that you're very unlucky. The gods do not favor you, and I refuse to help you." So Odysseus and his men have to leave. And the next place that they arrive at is the land of the cannibal race of giants, the Laestrygons. This encounter results in the loss of 11 of his 12 ships. Odysseus has gone from being essentially the commander of a whole fleet of ships with hundreds of men to the poor captain of one ship with only a few comrades. So after narrowly escaping from the Laestrygons, Odysseus has then his famous encounter with the witch goddess Circe. Now, this is a very famous encounter. Circe has the ability to turn men into animals. While they're exploring this island, Odysseus sends half of his men to go explore the island and go check out Circe's palace with a leader, a man he trusts named Eurylochus. They go and scope out Circe's palace. When they get there, Circe, of course, is singing in a sweet voice. She invites the men in. She seats them at her great table. She mixes them a potion, and then she adds this potion surreptitiously to a delicious-looking wine and cheese banquet. The men are having a good time. And then Circe turns them into pigs. The only one who stays behind is Eurylochus. Unlike his naive men, Eurylochus suspected the treachery all along, and he returns to Odysseus to report what happened to the other men. Odysseus decides to be the hero, and he then goes to Circe's palace to face her down. On his way, Odysseus meets the god Hermes, of course. He's always being helped by the gods, who gives him a plant called mole. This will protect Odysseus from Circe's charms. So when Odysseus arrives at Circe's palace, she tries to turn him into an animal, of course, but realizes she can't do it. So she suggests, perhaps because of this charm that Odysseus has, that they sleep together instead. Circe says, "There is a mind in you that no magic will work on. You are then resourceful, Odysseus. Argiphantes of the golden staff was forever telling me you would come to me on your way back to Troy with your fast black ship. Come then, put away your sword in its sheath, and let us two go up into my bed, so that lying together in the bed of love, we may then have faith and trust in each other." And this is how Odysseus responds. "Circe, how can you ask me to be gentle with you when it is you who turn my companions into pigs in your palace? And now that you have me here, myself, you treacherously ask me to go into your chamber and to go to bed with you, so that when I am naked you can make me a weakling, unmanned? I would not be willing to go to bed with you unless you can bring yourself, O goddess, to swear to me a great oath that there is no other evil hurt you devise against me." After she had sworn me the oath and made an end of it, I mounted the surpassingly beautiful bed of Circe. And this last bit is what he is telling the group assembled in Phaeacia who is listening to his story. And it's a great scene. I won't read any more, though I'd like to. At this point, readers would think, okay, it's time to go, Odysseus. Get out of there. She's already seducing you. Get out of there. It's time to go. Not so much. After a year of feasting and drinking on Circe's island, the Greeks at this point have had their fill, and they set off again, reaching the western edge of the world. Now, before leaving Circe's island, Circe tells Odysseus that in order to get home safely, he has to visit the land of the dead. She gives him complex directions to get to the land of the dead, and there he must consult the spirit of the old Theban prophet Tiresias. Tiresias will then tell Odysseus what he needs to do to get home safely. Tiresias also tells Odysseus that there are troubles back on Ithaca, that insolent men are eating away your livelihood, courting your godlike wife and offering gifts to win her. This part of Odysseus's journey is referred to often as Nicoia, from the Greek word the dead, and it can be seen symbolically as the death and rebirth of the hero Odysseus, marking a kind of spiritual cleansing that would be necessary as Odysseus finally readies himself to return home and reclaim his place as a father, a husband, and king in his homeland of Ithaca. In this scene, we meet not only Tiresias, but in the land of the dead, we also get to revisit the spirits of Agamemnon, Aias, Achilles, and others. So people from the Trojan War and people who we met in the Iliad, as well as that of his own mother, who died of grief at Odysseus's long absence. So in a way, going back to our death rebirth idea, this scene also allows Odysseus to revisit his past as well, to consult with the spirits of important people he had known and loved in order to then look forward and resume his life. So kind of dealing with the past to be able to look forward to the present. So in what remains of his journey, Odysseus overcomes several more obstacles, including evading these Sirens. This was something that Circe had warned Odysseus about. The Sirens lure sailors with their sweet voices. They entrance them and lure them to shipwreck on their island. You've probably heard of the Sirens. Odysseus was forewarned about this, and what he does to avoid the Sirens is he cuts up wax, and he puts this wax in his men's ears so that they won't hear the entrancing songs of the Sirens. So after skirting the home of the Sirens and passing between the many-headed monster Scylla and the whirlpool of Charybdis, Odysseus is punished. He's punished when his men kill and feast upon these cattle that they were not supposed to feast on, and that Odysseus knew they weren't supposed to feast on. This was taboo. His men feasted upon the cattle of the sun god Helios. And the punishment for this leads to shipwreck for Odysseus and his men. A shipwreck in which all but Odysseus himself end up drowning. So all of Odysseus's men are gone at this point. And thus, returning full circle to the beginning of our story, at this point, Odysseus, after all of this happens, ends up washing up ashore on Calypso's island. And that's how he gets there, where she keeps him as her lover for 7 years before being forced to let him go. Okay, so here we have come full circle. And now we're up to book 13. So we've just gotten through what is generally considered to be the most memorable and, the most famous portion of the Odyssey. And now here we are in book 13. And in book 13, we return to a straightforward chronological narrative. Books 13 through 24 finally show us Odysseus' homecoming to Ithaca, and lead all the way up to his killing of the suitors of his wife Penelope and the regaining of his power and status in Ithaca. So back to Scheria with the Phaeacians, because remember, that whole experience that we just went through, that was a story being told by Odysseus to entertain Alcinous and Arete and everyone else. So after listening with rapt attention to Odysseus' whole story, the Phaeacians help Odysseus get home, as they promised, and they deliver him one night to a hidden harbor on his home island of Ithaca. So he's back home, and he's disguised as a wandering beggar, and he comes telling a made-up tale of himself. So he's got a whole backstory, and Odysseus there meets a local swineherd, and he learns from this swineherd how things have been going in his household. So Athena at this point is still helping Odysseus out. Through Athena's devising, Odysseus ends up meeting with his son Telemachus. We have a kind of father-son reunion. Telemachus is just returning back from Sparta, where he had been talking to the red-haired king Menelaus, looking for his father. As for Odysseus, this is the first time he's actually seen his son in his entire life. So after sharing a meal, Odysseus is still in disguise, by the way. Telemachus goes into detail about how the suitors have flocked Odysseus's palace and how horrible it is. And Odysseus is at this point pulled aside by Athena, and Athena basically prompts Odysseus to tell his son the truth. It's time to reveal yourself to your son. So she changes his appearance back into his normal one. And when Telemachus first sees his father, he's amazed at the sight of this guy. He says, the stranger must be a deity. Only deities can change their appearance. No, says the stranger, I am Odysseus, right? So Odysseus and Telemachus, they finally figure out, oh my goodness, father and son, here we are. We're together for the first time. And they embrace, and they agree that the horrible, insolent suitors must be killed and that they've got to come up with a plan. So they outline the problem. Odysseus explains his plan. He's got a plan, and it's a plan that involves him being brought into the palace as a beggar. Telemachus will hide the suitors' weapons, and then Odysseus and Telemachus, with the help of some friends, they're going to kill all the suitors. Okay, it's going to be a bloodbath. So the plan is set in motion. With help from Athena, an archery competition is arranged by Penelope for the suitors. The winner will finally get to marry her. Whoever can string Odysseus' bow and shoot it through the holes in all 12 of the iron axe heads will get to marry her. So the disguised Odysseus then petitions the suitors to let him join the competition, which the suitors laugh at. They find this amusing, and Odysseus easily wins this competition. And he then promptly slaughters all of the other suitors with the help of Athena, Telemachus, and others. The weaponless suitors plead for mercy, but Odysseus, he shoots a man in the neck, with an arrow. Unfazed, Odysseus shouts at them, "You dogs! You never thought that I would any more come back from the land of Troy, and because of that, you despoiled my household. And you forcibly took my serving women to sleep beside you, and sought to win my wife while I was still alive, fearing neither the immortal gods who hold the wide heaven, nor any resentment sprung from men to be yours in the future. Now upon all of you the terms of destruction are fastened." Only now does Odysseus reveal and prove his true identity to his wife and to his old father Laertes. But Penelope, even despite Odysseus's display, even though she can see him in front of her with her own plain eyes, she doesn't believe that she's looking at her husband. And you can understand where she's coming from. She's in disbelief. So she says she has questions for this newcomer. So Odysseus asks an old nurse to bring a bed for him. He's exhausted. He's just done all this fighting. And Penelope's struck with an idea. She says, the real Odysseus would know a curious fact about their wedding bed. And that curious fact, secretly, is that this bed was built into an olive tree that grew in their bedroom and had been preserved when the palace was built. So if this was the real Odysseus, he would know this fact. So Odysseus, of course, was ready for this challenge. He says, "There's one particular feature in the bed's construction. I myself, no other man made it. Of an olive tree, with long leaves growing strongly in the courtyard, and it was thick like a column. I laid down my chamber around this and built it." And so he spoke, the narration goes on, and her knees and the heart within her went slack as she recognized the clear proofs that Odysseus had given. Then she burst into tears and ran straight to him, throwing her arms around the neck of Odysseus, and kissed his head. Now remember, she hasn't seen her husband in 20 years, had almost made terms with the fact that he was gone. And here he is, and she's embracing him. It's a beautiful moment in the story. Odysseus then reveals his identity to his father, and the reunion was sweet, although the trouble in Ithaca is not over yet. Odysseus, if you think about it here, Odysseus has effectively killed 2 generations of the men of Ithaca. Both the shipwrecked sailors that he journeyed with, those guys all died. And the men that he, even though they're scoundrels, the men that he had just executed, the suitors. So this effectively left Ithaca, which isn't a huge place. It's a very small island kingdom. This left Ithaca a mess, right? All the fathers are gone, right? All of these men are killed. All of these women are left without their husbands. And the conditions are riotous on Ithaca. The citizens are angry. And as the citizens begin to rise up in a mob and take arms against Odysseus and his son and his father, as is fitting, Athena intervenes one last time. She wants to see justice done. These suitors did a bad thing. So as Odysseus and Telemachus ready themselves for more fighting, they say, "Okay, bring it on, I guess." Athena screams, "Hold back, men of Ithaca, from the wearisome fighting, so that most soon, without blood, you can settle everything." So the people of Ithaca, at this, God screaming down at them, the people of Ithaca at once drop their weapons, and a pact is made, and this is how the story ends. A pact is made, quote, "sworn to by both sides." And all is well. So that's it for the Odyssey, and I want to remind listeners that was about the briefest summary that I could manage for the Odyssey. There is no substitute, of course, for cracking open the book and taking it nice and slow and reading it line by line. A summary just won't do it justice. So again, I would recommend the Richmond Lattimore translation of Homer's Odyssey. It's fantastic. It's very evocative. It's very beautiful. He has a tremendous feel for the rhythms and for achieving, I think, the kind of diction time that really puts you there in the Mediterranean. You're fighting monsters alongside of Odysseus. So I want to stop here before we get to our interview with the great classics rock star Daniel Mendelsohn, the New Yorker writer and author of An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic. I want to stop here to admire the astonishing complexity of Homer's Odyssey. There's a tendency among modern scholars to level the criticism against the Odyssey and the Iliad, often postmodern academics who generally don't see the Western canon as a useful concept. They will often deride the chronological simplicity and the linear modes of thinking embodied by these works and embodied by Homer. And yet this, too, is an oversimplification. This is just flat out wrong. The Odyssey, like many other classics of the Western tradition, does not follow a linear narrative. It is not straightforward. It doesn't have a kind of Manichaean, binary logic. It is, in fact, extraordinarily nonlinear and complex. A purely chronological reading of the Odyssey would have to put books 9 through 12 first, right? Followed by books 5 through 8. Here you'd also have to squeeze in the first 4 books, as these happen around the same time as books 5 through 8, followed by books 13 through 24. So the book jumps all over the place, and I think it does this to tremendous effect, right? All of the elements of tension and suspense are there, and the narrative builds. And it builds, and it builds, and it looks at things from the perspectives of various different people situated in different circumstances. And I think to say that a book like the Odyssey isn't complex, or to say that a book like the Odyssey just has a straightforward, boring, linear narrative, really means that you haven't read the Odyssey. Okay, really means that you haven't adequately grappled with the Odyssey. And you see that a lot of these criticisms that are being leveled against the classics are oftentimes by people who have never read the classics. So I think Mark Bauerlein put it best when he said, "You've got to read the bunk before you debunk." Okay, so time for our long-awaited, much-anticipated interview with the New Yorker writer Daniel Mendelsohn. Daniel Mendelsohn is an award-winning writer, critic, and translator. He was trained at the University of Virginia and Princeton University. He's a prolific contributor of essays, reviews, and articles, writing often for The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times Book Review, and many other outlets. His books include the international bestseller The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award and the National Jewish Book Award. He's written a memoir. This is called The Elusive Embrace. This was an LA Times Best Book of the Year. He wrote 2 collections of essays, How Beautiful It Is and How Easily It Can Be Broken, as well as Waiting for the Barbarians, essays from the classics to pop culture. How fun. And a 2-volume translation of the poetry of C.P. Kafavi. Daniel has won many awards, and he's a member of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Association. He teaches literature at Bard College. Let's get him on. Hi, Daniel. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here talking to you.
So you're a busy man right now. You just got back from your book tour in France. What was that like, and what has so far been the reception to your book, An Odyssey?
Well, I always loved doing my French book tour, partly because their education over there is so much more steeped in a kind of an old-fashioned, rigorous, mandatory, classical education. And I just find that they sort of get me over there in a way that's very satisfying. You know, I think their secondary and higher education still emphasizes a kind of knowledge of the classics. And when I say the classics, I'm not necessarily talking about the Greek and Roman classics, although that's included, but just have a very strong sense of national identity, that you have to have read certain things to be a good French person. And so I love being there because I don't have to explain anything, which is satisfying. So And it's always nice to be in Paris.
That's right.
And so that was fun. I was in Canada for a week, and that was very satisfying. I've been very lucky so far. The reviews have been very warm, and that's always gratifying all over. And so now I have a couple of days at home, and then I have a string of things this week. Then I'm in Norway for a week. Then I'm home a couple of days. I'm on the West Coast for a week. I'm home a couple of days. I'm in Texas for a week. I'm in London for a few days. And
Palutropos man.
Yeah, I'm pretty palutropos myself these days. But, I love going out with my books and talking to readers and meeting the people who are actually buying the books in bookstores. It's always a lot of fun. And it's the flip side of, writing is so solitary. So it's sort of nice to be in that phase where you're actually out in the world, not being so solitary. That's always nice.
Well, I could use a little bit of that solitary thing. At public school, English teacher, 5 classes a day, 5 days a week. It can get to be a little much. But I want to switch over to your book and talk about your book, which I'll hold up for my listeners here. This is called An Odyssey, a father, a son, and an epic. And your publisher kindly sent me a copy of this. So I have to say, I see you as not only a superb classicist, but you're one of my favorite writers. I read you in the New Yorker. I read your piece about, I think it was called An American Boy. About Mary Renault. And that's one of the things that I wanted to mention, that you find a way to seamlessly interweave the personal and the private with the literary and historical and mythological. You tell stories about your upbringing and your intellectual growth, and you give readers an intimate look at how great works of literature have shaped your identity as a man and as a classicist. In your new book, An Odyssey, this is exactly what you do. You use Homer's Odyssey as a vehicle for understanding your aging father and for examining your complex relationship with him. You use the Odyssey to explore your role as a father, and that was interesting to hear about, and also your intellectual coming of age. So I'm fascinated by this question. Of all the books, you've chosen Homer's Odyssey as a lens through which to give your readers a close, examined portrait of your life. Why the Odyssey? And take us through your book as well. Give listeners who haven't read your new book a brief summary and touch on this question of why the Odyssey?
Well, it's a good question. I can answer it in 2 ways, basically. There's the sort of clunky, practical way, which is that the Odyssey, because my dad at the beginning of 2011 asked me if he could sit in on the undergraduate Odyssey seminar that I was teaching at Bard College, where I have this part-time, half-time teaching position. And so, that was the course I was teaching. And the experience that resulted from having my father as a student in this freshman seminar is the basis of the book. And as just to quickly sketch the structure of the book. So the book basically has 4 parts, I guess. And there's an introductory section, which I call the proeme, which, as you know, is the formal term for the opening lines of any epic, where the poet introduces the themes and subjects of the poem. So that's sort of back history, my childhood, my father and I, stuff about his childhood. And then the first major section is about this class, the spring semester of 2011, when my father came every week and sat in on my Odyssey seminar, which had some rather comical and also poignant results. And then just as that class was ending in May of 2011, a friend of ours mentioned that she, a few years earlier, had taken a cruise that recreated the voyages of Odysseus throughout the Mediterranean. And we heard about this, and I asked my dad, and he said, we have to go on this cruise. So that's the second major part of the book. And then he fell ill not long after we got back. And so the last part of the book is his illness and demise. And so that it has sort of 3 major acts: the classroom, the cruise, and the hospital, preceded by this kind of introductory section. And so so I could say, well, this is a book about the Odyssey, and the Odyssey is a lens through which to think about my father and me and my relationships and all of that, because the Odyssey was the course he took. The more interesting answer to your question is, I've always felt I had to write about the Odyssey. I myself was trained by two classicists who were great authorities on the Odyssey. Jenny Strauss-Clay, my undergraduate mentor at the University of Virginia in the late 70s and early 80s, was a great Homeric scholar, and the Odyssey was her first book. And so I was always sort of shadowed by the Odyssey through my teachers. And I went on to Princeton, where I did my graduate work, and Froma Zeitlin was also very interested in the Odyssey, and in fact wrote a very famous paper about the marriage bed between that Odysseus builds for Penelope, which turns out to be a great plot point in the poem. And so I always felt like the Odyssey was sort of shadowing me in some way, and that, I guess some classicists like to joke that you're either an Iliad person or an Odyssey person temperamentally, and I am definitely an Odyssey person.
So am I.
And I think anyone who has read my other work knows that I'm very interested in problems of narrative and how narrative can substitute for facts. Sometimes this is obviously a subject we're all very aware of right now in American history, but in a more serious way. A previous book of mine was also a family memoir that had to do with the Holocaust, and I was very interested when I was doing interviews for that book about the way that sometimes people would tell themselves a story about what happened that didn't necessarily correspond exactly to the facts, but produced a reality that they believed in. And the tension between the sort of recorded facts and people's version of facts, to me, was incredibly interesting. It wasn't that they were lying. I think sometimes people convince themselves, that a story is true. We tell stories about ourselves in order to live, to quote the famous line. And so I've always been interested in narrative. And if you're interested in narrative and the tricks of narrative and the dangers of narrative, you've got to be interested in Odysseus, because he is the figure in Western literature of narrative. He's the great storyteller. He's the great liar. He makes up a whole series of stories and lies and half-lies in order to prevail. He's a master of language. He uses puns to vanquish his enemies, So I think I had to end up, just given my interests, I had to end up writing something about the Odyssey. The fact that the Odyssey happens to be a great father-son story, so much the better, because as you know, this is a story about me and what turned out to be the last year of my father's life.
So thank you for that. And one of my main aims in this episode is to talk about fathers and sons. The Odyssey, in many ways, is an interesting book for me, getting nice and personal here, in the sense that I never met my own biological father. There's a moment in your book, in one of the classroom scenes, in which a particularly incisive student weighs in on Telemachus's dilemma. Early on in the first few books of the Odyssey, when he's looking for his father, and the student notices that Telemachus, quote, keeps wobbling in his attitude about his father. In trying to track his father down, he quote, starts out hopeless, seems to get hopeful, and then goes back again to hopelessness. I'm quoting your book here. I can personally identify with this wobbliness. And yet at this point in my life, I can also identify with what your student says next, which is that, quote, for a boy who never even met his father, the question is, which is the larger crisis? Living out your life without a father, or actually meeting him for the first time 20 years later, having to get to know him. So that, to me, as you put it in your book, is scathingly brilliant. Now, for me, I have an adopted father and a stepfather, both of whom I love, and they're certainly enough for me. But I want to get your point of view. What specifically does the Odyssey have to say about fathers and sons? And how does the Odyssey speak to your relationship with your father specifically?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I think, many people have some sense of what the Odyssey is about, just from popular references. And, I remember when I was growing up, there was an episode of The Little Rascals that had a riff on the Cyclops scene. And people who know anything about the Odyssey tend to know one thing, which is that it's epic poem about a man who's trying to get back to his wife after being separated for 20 years. And 10 years during the war, 10 years during this very adventurous homecoming. But, if you look at the Odyssey carefully, a lot more real estate, as we say in the literature business, is given to the father-son relationship than to the husband-wife relationship, certainly as much. And the Odyssey actually doesn't begin with Odysseus. It begins with his son Telemachus, whom he had left as a baby when Odysseus went off to the Trojan War. It's now 20 years later. He's a young man. He's never had a father. And he needs to figure out what happened to Daddy. Is he still alive? Is he dead? If he's dead, is he going to be the king now? What's the status of his mother, who may be a widow, but maybe not a widow? And it actually, the first one-sixth of the poem is dedicated to this son who then goes on a fact-finding mission. That's the first adventure of the Odyssey. It's not the famous adventures of Odysseus,
right,
but in fact the adventures of his son, who goes out and interviews his father's war buddies to find out what happened, to try to get some information. So the poem begins with a son searching for the father, who is or will become the hero of the poem. But in fact, the structure of the epic underscores the importance of this father-son business. Because, in fact, so we all know that Odysseus eventually makes it home. He disguises himself. He infiltrates his own palace. He slays all these young men who have been trying to court his wife Penelope, and he is reunited with the wife. And people think that's the end of the poem. But, in fact, the very final, and he's gradually reunited with all these people he had left behind many years before. But, in fact, the last reunion in the Odyssey is not between Odysseus and his wife Penelope, but he then, after being reunited with the wife, then he goes looking for his father. That's the climactic reunion. So the structure of the Odyssey seems to underscore the fact that it is more than anything concerned with what is the relationship of a son to his father. Odysseus is in between because he's both a father of a young man and the son of an elderly man. And so much of the poem expresses a sort of series of anxieties about how do you know your father, right? Eventually he comes home, but he's now 20 years older. He's aged. There's this young 20-year-old guy. They have no relationship. They have no history together, and they have to come together and become a sort of fighting unit to vanquish, the 108 suitors who are hanging around the palace. And they have to become a team, but they don't know each other. And the poem, I think, and I tried to sort of underscore in my own book, the poem has a lot to say about how well can a son ever really know his father, and also how well a father can ever really know his son. And of course, in my book, I'm underscoring a kind of set of parallels between these fictional characters and me and my dad, with whom I did not have a close relationship at all in the first part of my life, just till about the age of Telemachus, give or take, until I was in my 20s. And then starting in my 20s, I decided I wanted to know this man a little better, and we eventually became quite close. And so my own story sort of roughly, as an astute reader of my book will see, maps onto the plot of the Odyssey. And you could say this entire book is about what I came to know about my own father through the experience of reading the Odyssey with him, having him as a student, going on this nutty cruise with him that recreated the journeys of Odysseus. And, it's funny. Anyone who's been in a reading group, and there are many reading groups right now, knows this phenomenon, which is, quite often from people's reactions to a book that you're reading together, you learn more about the reader than you do about the book. Certainly that was the case with me and my dad. I learned so much about my dad from his reactions to the text, which, as you know, the running joke of the book is he didn't even like the Odyssey. Right. He disapproved of Odysseus. He didn't think Odysseus was really a hero.
He's not a hero.
He's not a hero, he kept saying. It was funny because, my dad was a mathematician. He was a man of science. He didn't enjoy lies and tall tales. He was a straight shooter. He liked equations. He liked things to come out, to balance out neatly to a zero at the end. And Odysseus, of course, is the master bullshitter. of world literature, and my father couldn't bear him. That was the funny thing about the whole course. And so, I really learned a lot about him. And, you yourself jokingly use this word that I make much of in my book, which is an adjective that Homer uses to describe Odysseus, polytropos, which means a man who has many facets, a man of many twists and turns, which is the first adjective in the Odyssey, in the Greek text that's used of Odysseus. It's the first thing we hear about him as an audience. He's a man of many twists and turns. And I thought my father was a simple, straightforward man, until this experience. And as you know, he turned out to have some twists and turns of his own, and which I learned, through the experience of reading the book with him and going on the cruise with him. I learned many things about him. And that was, really very charming. But it turned out he had a lot of more facets than I thought of. And I was I was moved by that.
I was moved by it too.
Well, thank you. What is that word? I'm like, I underestimated my own father. And that was a kind of a lesson.
And part of that is probably because fathers have to act a certain way around their sons, and there's a certain side that they show to their sons. I found myself impressed with you in the book. I was impressed at how perceptive and probing you were with regard to your father. I mean, you're up there. The classroom drama scenes in your book were so interesting, were so well written, and I couldn't fathom having my mom sitting in my classroom. I don't know how you both paid attention to your lesson and sort of tracked your father's, identity throughout this process. It must have taken a lot of going home and journaling. And midway through the book, you actually start writing about your father's resistance to see Odysseus as a hero. He kept saying he's not a hero, and he gives all these different reasons why. And one of the big ones is that the gods keep helping Odysseus, whether it's Athena or Hermes or Zeus or some other force. And he raises, I think, I'm going to give your father some credit here. He raises an important concern that we discussed last episode of this show with respect to the Iliad. We talked about different conceptions of agency in the Homeric epics and to what extent these characters actually have free will in the sense that we're used to. Your father was unimpressed with Odysseus in a lot of ways, and in the beginning you said that you kind of thought this had to do with his aversion to religion in general, and yet one day, to drive his point home, he utters the words that sort of cue you into what's really going on. He says, "Without the gods, Odysseus is helpless. He's helpless." And this was when it hit you. It was that word helpless. You realized that for your father, who was a tough man and a self-sufficient man and a do-it-yourself kind of guy, Odysseus's willingness to receive help marks him as weak for your father in some ways. How do you approach this question? How do you respond to your father? How do you respond to your father's challenge with respect to Odysseus?
Well, it was funny. There's two issues you're bringing up, which are very interesting. One, I was talking before about how reading the Odyssey with my father revealed things about him that I hadn't really understood. And this was certainly one of them, which is his inability to see as heroic anyone who gets any kind of assistance. I thought was so poignant because, you just described my father, whom you know a little bit from, reading the book, as self-sufficient and a do-it-yourselfer and all of that. But, you also have to remember my dad was a product of the Depression. His adolescence was spent in World War II. And so, I think he had a real horror certainly his experience as a child during the Depression gave him a horror of feeling like you had to depend on others. You needed a handout. That was his worst nightmare. And I think that was a nightmare that haunted him and his father throughout the 1930s. So I think there was a psychological bruise from the Depression. But many of the complaints that my father very vociferously raised in class to the character of Odysseus, were actually complaints that scholars have been raising for millennia about the character of Odysseus. Odysseus is not a straightforward hero. I'm not so bothered by the getting help from the gods problem. You're just in an ancient epic and that's what happens. It doesn't detract from your innate qualities to receive help any more than it does for people today. It's like if you're some talented young person and you get help from an editor or whatever, it doesn't mean you're worthless, right? It just means sometimes it's nice to get a push in the right direction. My father couldn't bear that idea, though. But many of his objections, did kind of dovetail with traditional complaints about Odysseus. He does lie. He is a preeminent liar. He does rely on the gods. He does fabricate stories that suit his purpose. He is a little bit shady. He doesn't always use kosher, as it were, weapons. The first thing you hear about Odysseus in the very first story you hear about him is, oh yeah, I remember that guy. He once came looking for poisoned arrows. Poisoned arrows is not a kosher Homeric weapon. You're not supposed to be using poison arrows. So everything about him is a little tainted, I would say. And my father, who was not a literature person the way you and I are, he wasn't a teacher of literature. He was a very well-read person. He was a science guy. He just somehow intuited, I think quite correctly, some of the problems with this character. And for him, a hero is a very specific thing. Didn't necessarily totally overlap with the Greco-Roman notion of a hero, but for him to be a hero meant you were totally self-sufficient, you didn't complain, you didn't cry, you didn't rely on handouts, and, Odysseus does not fit that bill.
That's right, and your father did not like the fact that he often cries.
The crying drove him crazy, because that, for my father, was the word. You could never show emotion. That was a real weakness to my father. And, Odysseus is always crying. At the beginning of the poem, when we first see him, he's weeping, he's wailing, he wishes he was dead. He's so sad to be, lost in the middle of nowhere. And my father threw up his hands in despair and said, how could we call this guy a hero? But in essence, he's asking a very good question, which is what kind of hero is Odysseus? Right,
and in reading your book, as much as your father seems to me to be a do-it-yourself, independent, a man of hardness, I felt connected to your father. You describe his penchant for difficulty and precision and hardness, and yet you describe a similar hardness in learning languages and studying the classics. And I want to quote your book here. You said, when I began to study Greek, I found an equally satisfying flintiness, not only in the myths or dramas themselves, but in their bones, the language itself, a syntax that was as stark as Antigone's choices, that allowed for no messiness or approximation. The paradigms of nouns and adjectives that ran across the page of the slim black textbook that we used in Greek 101 were as crisp and as unforgiving as theorems. You you even say in your book that your relationship with your father as a young man was as a young adult was rekindled by both of your shared passion for rigor. And you suggest that this is one of the reasons that you studied the classics and classical philology appealed to you. Your father even said, it's not science. Science is science. Can you talk about some of the things that drew you to the classics as a young man? And also, as a follow-up question, can you speak to the health of the discipline at this very moment, both in the academy and in the cultural sphere?
Well, I know I always say this. It's a very Odyssean way of replying to her questions. There's always two ways of answering the question. So as I was writing this book and thinking so much about my father and our relationship, it certainly occurred to me that, one reason I chose the classics as a field was that subconsciously, I now realize I thought it might please my father because it was so difficult. And my father worshipped difficulty. I mean, this was a patent, articulated theme of our childhood. It's not like we felt it. He literally said, a thing is more interesting in direct proportion to its difficulty. He worshipped things that were difficult. And for him, that was the mark of quality, if something was naughty, difficult. And so the classics, when you study the classics seriously, it's a rigorous discipline. You have to master these extremely difficult languages, which in their way, you could see how it would impress a mathematical sensibility. You have to master these paradigms and these sort of metastasizing verbal forms and whatever. And I think probably it's safe to say that I did choose classics subconsciously because it was tough. It was a tough discipline. That said, there were other factors, and I'm only quoting a now deceased famous classicist called Jack Winkler, who died in the 90s, who I think he wrote an essay once, and he said, naked bodies and lascivious acts. Who can resist Greek mythology, And so I'm sure that had a part to do with it. As you know from reading my essay, The American Boy, as a gay teenager, the idea that there had once been this civilization where it was not a problem to be gay was certainly had its own allure. I'm sure that also was part of the issue. So I think, as with many people, look, there's nothing more interesting than intellectual genealogies, how you get interested in subjects. And to me, it's the most fascinating. And it is, I think, a mixture of psychological factors, historical factors, and just the random, what hits you, the randomness of coming across something. It's interesting, though, I now think that actually my first great love that I was very serious about was Egypt, not Greece. And yet that ultimately didn't hold the kind of interest for me. I'd learned hieroglyphics. I was a complete nerd. I was just obsessed by ancient Egypt, but it didn't have legs, and for all the reasons we've just discussed, I think Greece really captivated my imagination. I actually think that, I like to joke now when I have so few causes for optimism of any kind about the national or world scene. I'm actually, the only thing I may be optimistic about is the future of the classics.
Really?
I think, we're always complaining that, the humanities are threatened and blah, blah, blah. And there's no question that that's true. But my sense is that there is always a hardcore of kids who are going to be interested in this material, and they are going to find a way to study it. I grew up on Long Island, but I went to university at UVA and University of Virginia. And, I was just talking to Jenny Clay, my undergraduate mentor, who's now an emerita professor there. And, I think they have 70 classics majors. I think in the South particularly, there's a strong tradition of studying Latin in public high schools. So I think we're certainly in a sort of dark time. The humanities, expertise, scholarship, all the things that we value as humanists are having a little bit of a troubled time right now. But from my own experience, I think there's always young people who are interested in this, and they will find a way to do it. And look, when you're a classicist, you have a very long view of things, right? So,
That's
right. I always we've had hard times before, the Dark Ages was no picnic, but we got through that, So I'm always struck, whenever I write these articles that you mentioned earlier when introducing me, I write for the New Yorker, articles about Thucydides or Herodotus. There's a new translation of the Iliad, whatever. I get huge responses to these articles. There are a lot of people out there who are interested in the classics, who read them in high school and want to reread them. They read them in reading groups. I can't tell you how many adult reading groups I've been invited to speak at, of people who want to know or be reacquainted with the Aeneid or the Odyssey or whatever. I think there's a lot of interest out there. And one of the things that gives me great joy, and one of the things that I've dedicated, I guess, my career to, is talking to those people. As I always like to say, the classics are classics for a reason. These texts really are great. It's not like we're trying to sell you a bad car and dress it up as a Cadillac. They really are great, And they're great because they say in a very powerful and stylish and original way things about the human condition that have never changed, because human nature never changes. The gadgets change. Now we have intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the Athenians only had, hoplite warfare. But, take away the gadgets and everything is the same. And that's why the classics are classics. They just say these things with great power, and we turn to them, because they have great authority. And they're fun to read. Mm-hmm. I have news for you, So I'm not actually, that's one of the few things I'm not pessimistic about right now. I really think, and in fact, I would say that the darker times are and the more confusing the cultural moment is, that's how much more people turn back to the classics for a kind of solidity. Like, that's the bedrock, and people always turn to these works when things are confusing. And I think that that's something to think about. They don't become less relevant.
Sure.
They become more relevant.
I hope that that's true. And I hope that if you're right about this, that remains the case. And one thing that we might need if we're going to return to the classics is, I wonder if we need to put down our devices, right? I was reading Great Books by David Denby. And he was talking about the one thing that he noticed. He said, kids are just as smart as they ever were. They're just as wonderful. They're just as passionate. But one of the things that he was worried about is he was sitting in these classics courses at Columbia University. He went back and took the Great Books curriculum that he had taken when he was there as an undergrad. And he said that the one thing, the big difference that he noticed is that there was still a hunger to be an intellectual, to have knowledge, but he was saying that there was a lack of that obsession, that it had been the case when he went to school. There were kids who were just obsessed with the Greek tragedians, and that's all they did. And they came to college and they knew Latin and Greek, and they were utterly obsessed. And I wonder if our attention spans aren't being fragmented. Do you see handheld technology and sort of the fragmentation of our attention spans as being a threat to our consumption of these long pieces that require a great deal of our unadulterated attention?
Well, I think there's I think there's two issues at stake here. I think I do worry about attention spans, and not only for the students, let me say, where all of our attention spans are being
absolutely
toyed with by these toys that we have. I worry about my ability to read 400 pages of a novel straight without checking my email or my, so let's not just lay it on the kids. I mean, right. They're born into this world. I was not, but it seduced, not just children, but grown-ups too. And I think, to be fair, we have to admit that. I'm worried about everybody's attention span. And it is a problem. It is a problem. Look, I love to tell a story of how when I was a third-year student at UVA, I took a big fat Russian novels course. I was a classics major, and I thought, I may never get to take a course like this again. So I took it, and I read Anna Karenina in one sitting, I remember.
Oh my goodness!
Well, it's a great novel. I have news for you, and it was like 4:00 on a Friday afternoon. I started reading. I couldn't put it down, and then it was midnight and 1:30 and 2:30, and I thought, to hell with it, and I just read till like 5 a.m. I couldn't do that now. No one could do that now, because the cell phone would be ringing, the emails would be pinging, the text messages would be coming in. So I worry about that. That's something we should worry about, because some of these works, look, especially epics, which are long, complicated works with many arcs of many different lengths, you have to pay attention to know what's going on. I was sitting on the Amtrak train from New York to upstate New York, where I lived, about a year ago, and I was sitting next to this young guy who was maybe a college senior, and I was so happy because he was reading, I think it was a huge 18th century English novel like Pamela, something like that, one of those 1,000-pagers. And I thought, wow, I'm so impressed by this kid. And then I started watching him read, and every minute and a half, like a Pavlovian dog, he would look over to his cell phone to see if he was getting a message. And I thought, how can you read this book? You can't, there's no through line. So that is a worry. On the other hand, I think we should always guard against false nostalgia to the great era when everyone was excited about the classics. Mary Beard, who's a very well-known classicist, as I'm sure you know, based in England and writes often, gave a very funny lecture a few years ago that I attended about the history of lamenting the end of the classics. And it goes right back to ancient Rome. You know, even in classical days, people were kvetching about how no one was interested in the classics anymore. So, you know, that's just a sort of a kind of a built-in cultural feeling. And all it means is we're always worried about this material, and we're always worried that people will stop caring about it.
That's true.
But in fact, in 2,000 years, no one has stopped caring about it.
That's right.
So I think we should balance our anxiety with the reassurance provided by history, which is, we've always been worried, and it's always managed to stick around.
Great.
So that's what I mean when I say I'm a little optimistic. So far, there are still kids in universities, young students who are obsessed with Greek tragedy, and they may not look like the kids David Denby knew when he was an undergrad. That doesn't mean they're not there. They're wearing earbuds now, and they've got piercings and tattoos, but they're still interested. So I do think we have to take a deep breath and not get too worry. This goes back to what I was saying before. This stuff is very appealing, and people will always find that appeal. I'm convinced of it.
Well, you're making me feel better. In your book, you get the sense that Homer's Odyssey can really speak to us today, like you said. And one idea that gets repeated over the course of your book is that the poem itself, the actual words on the page, not the places necessarily, or the mythology, or the history, but the poem itself is what is real for both you and your father. And in fact, in the act of going on an Odyssey cruise, which was something that you had reticence about, so I'll just tell my listeners, the Odyssey cruise that Daniel goes on with his father is a Mediterranean cruise that traces Odysseus' journey in the Odyssey. Your father even repeats this idea on the cruise, that despite being on the Aegean Sea and seeing the ruins of Troy, etc., the poem itself, the words on the page, the story rather than the place, is what felt real to him. Yeah. Can you expound on what that means to you? How is the Odyssey still alive for you today, and how did it come alive for your father? I mean, you've spent a good portion of your life on the Odyssey. How is it real for you today?
Well, I think what my father was trying to express, which of course was very gratifying to me as a teacher of literature and as someone who has devoted his life to writing about literature and writing, is that, so you read the Odyssey, you spend 5 months analyzing it in quite great depth in a seminar, and then you go, you sail off, you take the plane to Athens, you sail to the place in Turkey, which is the site of the ancient city of Troy, and you see a bunch of broken down walls. Obviously, I'm not denigrating archaeology. Obviously this is stuff of immense importance. But I think what my father realized in that moment, and again, I emphasize, he is not a person like us who has dedicated his life to literature. He was a scientist who was very well read and loved reading literature. But I think that was the moment where it hit him, where, when you have mastered a great work of literature, or begun to master a great work of literature, thought about it in depth, it seems to have a reality that is three-dimensional. You talk about these characters, you find yourself talking about these characters as if they're real people. You worry about them, Every time I read the Odyssey, I'm always afraid Odysseus isn't going to make it to the end. It seems to have a kind of three-dimensional breathing reality. And I think it hit him for the first time being in these ruins of these places which are so vividly described in the poem, that this is a different kind of reality. And he said that famous line, which became the sort of mantra of the cruise everywhere we went. It's interesting, but it's not as real as the poem, which of course was very gratifying to me. And I think this is an experience, this is, interestingly enough, an experience that Proust describes a lot in his novel, the slight disappointment of finally seeing a place you've thought about a lot, and it never quite matches your imagination. So it's really a kind of a tribute to the power of the imagination, which can reconstruct out of the 7 broken columns the whole temple.
Well, if we were all like Proust, we could just line our walls with cork and just, reinvigorate Cambrai.
Right, exactly. But that's what we do. That's what I think it was the moment when my father actually saw what literature can do, that it's not some idle pastime, but does a real thing in the world, which constructs a satisfying experience, if you think about it. Obviously, I think the Odyssey has meaning. Obviously I'm pleading my own cause. I'm a literature person, but if you're a literature person, literature is not icing on the cake of life. It's not something you get to do in your free time. It's not something you get to do if you have a spare moment after you've made your money or whatever. It is the thing that gives meaning to life. That's what we turn to when we want to know what life is about. And certainly what my book is about is how much I learn to appreciate about what the Odyssey can tell you about not only fathers and sons, although that's a lot right there, but also dying. The Odyssey, the metaphor of the Odyssey is about a journey that becomes so interesting, it's in danger of, he becomes in danger of not getting to his destination, right? He accidentally lands in so many fascinating places and meets so many fascinating and creepy and monstrous and beautiful, exotic aliens and creatures and whatever. It's really a kind of a proto-science fiction narrative that he almost doesn't make it home. And it's so clearly a metaphor for life, right? That it is the journey that's interesting, because we all know what the destination is. That's not so interesting, And at one point, as you know, my father reflected on this kind of paradox, which is, getting home means dying in a way. It means the adventure is over, and the adventure is life. So I think the Odyssey has great kind of symbolic power as well. It's a parable about living. Look, it's also obvious, as I discussed with my father on the cruise, a prototype for the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, I remember that.
It is a Wizard of Oz. And what is the Wizard? Everyone knows what the Wizard of Oz is about. It's about the power of fantasy and the power of imagination and appreciating home, which is only possible after you've been away from home, So this is a text that has, is so enormous in its implications about family relationships, about what marriage is like, about what children can understand about their parents, which is a huge subject, or rather what children will never understand about their parents, which I think is one of the great lessons about the Odyssey, which I didn't understand until I had this particular experience, about fathers and sons, husbands and wives. Adventure, journeying, what it means to come home again. What does home mean? What does home mean, actually? We talk about it so much. And another thing I want to say about the Odyssey is because, my father had a problem with Odysseus because he was so complicated. He seemed to be heroic and powerful. He's a great warrior, but he needs help. He's incredibly brave and faces these weird aliens, but he cries a lot, And
he cheats.
And he cheats, but also, he wants what's his. He's happy to cheat other people, but the whole point of the poem is him coming back and reclaiming his property, his wife, his palace, his kingdom. And as someone once said to me, one of my teachers, my father's problem looking at the Odyssey is he was seeing the complexity as the problem rather than the solution.
Right.
That's who Odysseus is.
Right.
He is a complicated character. He is not reducible to good or bad, brave or cowardly, impressive or skeezy, and I think particularly in a culture right now that wants to keep reducing everything to winners and losers, thumbs up, thumbs down, 5 tomatoes, no tomatoes, 5 stars, 0 star. I think one of the greatest things about the Odyssey is that it is an argument for complexity, for the virtues of complexity, that you don't want to keep reducing everything to facile, pre-chewed, pre-digested, quantities, that the real point of life is struggling with complexity and appreciating complexity. And the Odyssey does that by giving us one of the most complicated heroes in Western literature. And I think it's an invitation to look at our own lives and to stop looking for, it keeps raising the question, who is Odysseus? And the joke is he's many things at once, as most of us are. Most of us are one thing with our parents, another thing with our lovers, another thing with our children, another thing with our friends. You don't show the same Jordan Alexander Hill to your college buddies as you do to your great aunts. So does that mean you're hopelessly indecipherable? No, it just means you've got many sides like Odysseus. And if you see people in their totality, you will have a much healthier understanding of life. Right? That's what the Odyssey is about. I was able to do with my father, finally, in a way I was never able to do with him before.
That's a really beautiful way to think about the Odyssey. And speaking of complex characters, one of the chapters in your book is called Homophrosyne, which you translated. You translated all of the Greek in your book, which I was really impressed with. And homophrosyne means like-mindedness, right? Mm-hmm. Especially between two people in a relationship. And in many ways, the Odyssey is not just about a complex man and his journey home, or a son's journey to find his father, but it's also about a wife, Penelope, waiting for her husband, a wife who is trying to conceive of her identity after 19 years. I'm sure the last 10 of which were very agonizing. Right. She has to ask herself, am I a wife or am I a widow? Right. Should I remain steadfast in my loyalty to my husband, or is my husband dead, in which case I have to remarry? So there seems to be no sign of Odysseus coming home. The suitors are pressuring her. Telemachus, in my opinion, isn't capable of being the man of the house. And I was thinking about this, and in the world of the Odyssey, in ancient Greece, a woman couldn't just have it all. You had a role. No. And Penelope has to make a choice, right? So, Daniel, how do we conceive of Odysseus's relationship with Penelope? And how do we regard Penelope as a character in a world where you don't have so much independence if you're a woman? And then lastly, are Odysseus and Penelope actually like-minded?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, there's, just as the Odyssey keeps landing Odysseus in different new lands, islands, continents, where he meets new civilizations, he's like Captain James T. Kirk, basically.
I thought about that.
Which is another Odyssean text, actually, the Star Trek, right? That you're going to go on this, mission to boldly go where no one has gone before, which is what Odysseus does. And implicitly, through interacting with these other civilizations, other creatures, aliens, whatever, you appreciate your own. You come to understand what your own means. Odysseus, in a way, can't go back to Ithaca until he has had these adventures, because it's only after having these adventures that he can appreciate Ithaca.
Interesting.
Right? Which is notoriously poor and rocky. It's not an opulent, lavish, wealthy island, and yet he still wants to go home to it because now he can appreciate it, having been to all the other places. And the reason I'm saying that is it's an exact parallel to Penelope. Right? One of the things the Odyssey also gives to Odysseus is the opportunity to hook up with all these fabulously beautiful goddesses and nymphs, and he gets around. He's not celibate in 20 years. There's, I think, also a strong suggestion that he has a little thing with Helen of Troy, who is, so he keeps meeting potential mates as well as potential homes. Because the Odyssey is always sort of raising the implicit question, why not just get off on one of these other islands with beautiful, lush vegetation and stay there? Why do you have to get off?
Yeah.
Right. And so it's also asking, what's so special about Penelope? After all, these goddesses are throwing themselves at Odysseus. For 7 years, he's kept prisoner by Calypso, the nymph Calypso, who's more beautiful than Penelope could ever be. And Penelope's mortal. She's old. She's now a middle-aged lady. And Calypso will also be young and beautiful. In fact, she offers him immortality, right? In return for staying with him. And he says no. So that, to me, is one of the most moving things in all of Western literature, right? He chooses death in order to have Penelope. So that raises the question, what's so special about this girl, okay? And we get to see that as the poem unfolds. At first, she's a distraught, rather passive character. She doesn't know how to, she's tried to think of all these stratagems to keep the suitors at bay. She's at her wit's end, we're at the moment where you think she's finally just going to give in and marry someone, just get it over with. And of course, at that very moment, he comes home. But Odysseus himself, in a very famous passage, in fact, talking to one of these other females who was offered as a potential alternative to Penelope, the beautiful young princess Nausicaa. And he's telling her, I'm going to tell you what a good relationship is. And it all depends on this thing which he calls homophrosyne. And what is homophrosyne? Homophrosyne is like-mindedness, right? To have a similar way of thinking to someone, I think, is the best way you would translate it if you wanted to be very literal, right? To think in a similar fashion. Why is that so important? And by the end of the poem, Penelope demonstrates that she is, in fact, just as tricky, just as polytropos, just as many-sided, just as clever with words, just as conniving as he is. So, in fact, she demonstrates that she is the right woman for him. And it's important because as time passes, you age, you lose your physical charms. It happens to everyone. Wait and see, And so the Odyssey is, I would say, not only an argument for complexity, but an argument in favor of interiority. That is, the inner self is unchangeable. And that's what you're really drawn to in a healthy relationship. It's not the body, the biceps, the boobs, the thighs, everything that everyone is spending 2 hours every day in a gym trying to have. And I can tell you, by the time you're looking at 60, it all sags anyway, right? So that's what the Odyssey is about. It's what really makes someone, what really draws you to someone. What really is sexy about people is their mind. I always say Odysseus is a sort of proto-Woody Allen, right? Because he demonstrates that mind is the sexiest thing. And that's what ultimately connects people. If everyone spent 2 hours in a day instead of in the gym working on their quads and went to the library for 2 hours a day working on their souls and their minds, we'd have a lot better relationships. So I think that that's the importance of Penelope in the poem to some extent, is she is, appealing to him because of who she is, not because she's beautiful like these goddesses are, And also it raises a very interesting question, which I think we're still interested in today, which is that you feel like there is one person for you.
Right.
For whatever nutty reason.
Your father mentions this.
But yes, my father, that he got. And that one of the climaxes of the book, as you know, is when my father, who was hardly emotional and not given to sentiment, suddenly, when we were discussing exactly what you and I are talking about now, homophrosyne and the climactic reunion between Odysseus and Penelope, when Penelope tricks Odysseus into revealing that he's really Odysseus, in a very Odysseus-like way, my father suddenly said, well, I can tell you what it's like to be married to someone so long that they don't look like the person that you married anymore. They're not the beautiful young girl you married. And yet you're still connected, and so he was talking about my mom. And, most of these kids, they're 17 years old. My parents were together for 64 years. It's, more than three times as long as their whole lives, right? And they can't yet appreciate the wisdom of the Odyssey, which is what truly connects you, is not the surface fun stuff. let's call it. It's these other things that you have with someone. And I think Penelope really does pay off in the end. She is an impressive figure. She has just as many troubles as Odysseus does. In fact, one of the climactic moments of the Odyssey, when they finally are reunited and she's now accepts that it's he, because remember, they don't look the way they did when they last parted. She was 20, he was 21, now she's 40, he's 41, whatever. It's when Homer, at the moment when, they finally break down in tears and embrace each other, and he says, she is like a sailor who has been shipwrecked, who finally sees land again. And he's describing Penelope, which is a simile that likens her to Odysseus, who really has been shipwrecked, as we know, right? That's one of the most recurring themes. So she's had her own adventures, even though in some ways, superficially they're opposites. He travels endlessly. She sits at home all the time in the same place, right? They seem to be opposites, but ultimately they both had their terrible trials and adventures, and that's why they're matched. It's a real, we say people are really matched. They are really matched. They're not identical, but they both have suffered. They both have had to prove themselves. They have both had to use their wiles more than physical force to maintain their positions. And maybe she more than he, because she has fewer tricks, she has fewer tools at her disposal. She's a woman. She can't fight. She can't battle people. She can't put on armor and drive the suitors away by force of arm.
She's got the loom.
Yeah, she's got her famous trick with the loom, weaving this shroud and secretly unweaving it all the time. So I think she is an impressive character. I was just having an exchange with a classics professor who had read my book, and she said, well, but don't forget that the real match for Odysseus, the real homo fortune, may not be Penelope, it may be Athena, his divine protectress. Athena's always looking out for Odysseus, and they clearly enjoy each other a lot. There's a lot of banter. But, they're not really matched, because Athena is divine, and she's going to live forever. And Odysseus is getting older, as we all are. And so it's a nice idea, but ultimately I don't think they're ideally matched. Odysseus and Penelope are matched. And so this is also the story of a marriage, and a very poignant story of a marriage, most of which has been taken place in absentia, right? They were a young couple with a newborn baby when he went away. So most of their marriage has been absence, and yet they still come together in a very satisfying way at the end, which means there's something really there.
Yeah, and she's strong too. There seems to be this inner core about her. She is a strong woman. So the last thing I want to touch on for our interview is of particular interest to this podcast. In 2014, you wrote a short essay for the New York Times. It was like an op-ed. It was you and another writer. You were giving opposing perspectives on Harold Bloom's book, The Western Canon, and how it would be received nowadays. I found Bloom's book an inspiration and a big achievement, not for anything profound that the book said or put forth, but for the fact that in an age of ideology, in an age of identity, that I was impressed that someone like Bloom was sticking his neck out and unabashedly praising the idea of an authoritative canon. And I wanted to get your take on canons, the intellectual question or the scholarly question of literary canons. In his book, he's making the case for a canon. He's making the case for reinstating aesthetic criticism, which is not in fashion. And a return to seeing imaginative literature as something that is fulfilling and ultimately something that can be a deep pleasure. In your article, you defended the canon. You said that while there was justice on both sides of the argument, ultimately literary canons are important. Even as they progress and become more inclusive, that's great. That in the internet age, the determination of this canon can be even more democratic nowadays. And less elitist. Do you still feel this way, Daniel, in 2017? Do you feel in the throes of what seems to be another culture wars, but an even uglier one. How do you think the idea of a Western canon is faring? Like, what's your take on this at this point?
Well, I think, whatever we may think, it's there. We may wish it were otherwise, but you could first say that the Western canon is there, right? You can treat the canon descriptively. There is this body of work. It has shaped writers and thinkers in our civilization for the past 2,000 years, whether you like it or not, whether you wish they were different books or different writers, sorry, but those are the ones. They shaped the people who created this nation. They shaped the thinkers of this nation. So even if you object to the specific items in the canon, it's there. You can't wish it were otherwise. And even if you don't like them, it's your responsibility intellectually to know them, I would say. So that's one way to do it, what I call the descriptive approach. This is the Western canon is Plato, Aristotle, Euripides, Sophocles, Dante, Homer, Shakespeare. You can't make that go away.
Well, you can erase it, right, in the collective consciousness.
No, you cannot teach it, but it's still going to have done the work that it did. It's like gravity. You can pretend that gravity doesn't exist, but you're going to fly in an airplane and it's going to fly because those are the laws of nature. The same thing with the Western canon. It did exist. It has existed. It has shaped the world we live in. If you want to understand the world you live in, I have news for you. You have to know the Western canon as traditionally defined. That said, look, I'm a gay person. I didn't necessarily see myself reflected in the works of the Western canon that I read when I was a student. And obviously now canons as defined and taught in universities or high schools, obviously, are adapting to the current world, right? So there's what I was saying before, the canon is traditionally defined. That exists. You have to know it if you want to understand the world we're in. But obviously canons are necessary. The canon is shifting. It is expanding, right? When I went to college, Toni Morrison was not a canonical American author, and now she is. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Because she, in her works, is describing an aspect of American experience which is vital, crucial, and unignorable, and she has done a great job of writing about that. So we can name any number of other people who are now part of the canon, but we will always need canons because the canon is the body of work that expresses the values of a culture at any given moment. So there's the historical canon, which I was talking about before, but there's the living canon, which expresses who we are, and who we now are, hopefully, is more inclusive. And it has, so who we now are, say, as Americans, teachers of American literature, has now expanded to include James Baldwin, Toni Morrison,
Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison.
Richard Wright. Okay, that's about race. So we're obviously dealing with race for the first time in modern history in a way that includes these great texts by African-American authors as part of the American canon. I'm sure the same could be said of any other number of identities, right? That the canon has adapted and expanded as it must, because they are now part of our values, hopefully now include inclusivity, multiculturalism. So I'm not, I'm not pessimistic about this. But you have to think about the canon in a complicated way. There's the historical canon, which shaped our culture for better or for worse. You need to know it to understand where we are now. But the living canon of authors whom we want our young people to experience in order to understand the world we live in, which is different from the world as it was 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. And I think in that way, it's a much healthier way to think of the whole problem. I don't see it in these apocalyptic terms.
But I think, Daniel, that you and I would probably both agree that rightfully so, that Toni Morrison and James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison and these other great writers that are part of the canon now are not part of the canon because an individual group, an identity group, saw themselves in Toni Morrison, but that Toni Morrison speaks to things that are universal to the human experience, that someone over here can say that Toni Morrison's writing about race, but I can say that she's writing about alienation and violence and anxiety and modernity and.
Right. I think you're right. But I think, and I'm not trying to sit on the fence, but I can see both sides of the argument, right? So I totally get what you're saying. If Toni Morrison were only writing about, say, a Black American experience to reduce it in a horrible way, just for the sake of argument, in a way that had no artistry, no larger application, no universality, then it would not be canonical. Things that are on the canon are also understood to have a kind of largeness. And, weirdly enough, and this is the paradox of literature, it is through brilliant specificity that literature achieves universality. So Toni Morrison, writing Beloved, is writing about a certain group of people at a certain moment in history, about a certain story in a certain specific culture. But because art is art, I, as a white male, can read Toni Morrison and feel that I understand it, just as I would hope that Toni Morrison can read Homer and see it as about something other than dead white people.
Yeah.
Right? It works both ways. Right. And in fact, I said to a student of mine, I was teaching a great books course at Bard, the second half of our mandatory 2-semester first-year great book sequence. And I had a fabulous young woman in class who was an African-American girl, and she was the only African-American in the class, which she instantly raised and said, we need to talk about the fact that I'm the only African-American. We did, and it was very productive. And, and at some point, she said, well, sometimes I feel, why do I have to read these works by these dead white European guys? And I said, I understand what the objection is. We're all talking about this. We're all sensitive to these issues. We're trying to make our canon more inclusive, more multicultural. I said, but be careful of that argument, because if you can't read Plato because he's a dead white male and you're a young black woman from South Carolina, then I can't read Toni Morrison because I'm a white guy and she's a black woman. That argument cuts two ways. And What one really hopes for in thinking about this, and as I get older, and it may be naive, I really feel that what one wants to be cultivating is a larger human identity, irrespective of sub-identities. Not that those are not important, because they are part of who we are. But that there is some larger commonality that human beings share, and that's why we can read other literatures. That's why we should read other literatures. If it's only about me and my specific narrow experience, then I'm not going to learn anything from other literature. And so, it's a complicated question, and one wants to be sensitive to all the issues, but I do think that what makes great literature great, and therefore worthy of being in a canon, is precisely its ability to transcend the particulars of its own narrative and to somehow speak to a larger experience. Look, I can read Jane Austen. I have read Jane Austen. I frequently reread Jane Austen, which is a canonical Anglophone author. And I'm not a, British spinster of the early 19th century, and yet there's something about Jane Austen that seems to me to say, be about being a person, a human person, that is larger than the particulars of its own story. Not that the particulars aren't crucial.
Right.
That's the trick of literature.
Right.
That's why we love literature. So I feel very strongly that we should spend more time thinking about the universals than about the particulars, or at least balance them in some way that's productive for everybody.
Thank you so much for joining me and spending your time with me, your valuable time. I'm sure you don't have a lot of it right now, but I really appreciate it, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, so do I, and this is what I'm happy to talk about, so it's not a drain on my time. It's what my time is for.
Keep it up. Keep doing the great work that you do.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
This was so much fun.
Thanks. Bye. Okay, so now time for our Scholar's Den segment. And I have to transition quickly here because otherwise we'll run over on time. I'd like to introduce our next guest, one of my favorite living philosophers and the author of the great book Explaining Postmodernism. In episode 1 of this podcast, we talked at length about postmodernism, and we analyzed some of its central claims. We talked in some depth about its role as an antagonist of sorts to the project of liberalism and Western civilization, and we considered the extent to which postmodernism is a kind of oppositional force to the Western literary tradition. My next guest, Stephen Hicks, while he's a strident critic of postmodernism and one who seems to reject nearly all of its central tenets, claims that postmodernism is actually part of the Western canon and the Western literary tradition. Postmodernism is part of our story, he claims. It's part of the great conversation. In his book, Explaining Postmodernism, Stephen Hicks traces postmodernism from its roots in Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Immanuel Kant to its development in thinkers such as Michel Foucault and Richard Rorty. In his book, Stephen provides a provocative account of why postmodernism has been the most vigorous intellectual movement of the 20th century. Why do skeptical and relativistic arguments have such power in the contemporary intellectual world? Why has a significant portion of the political left, the same left that traditionally promoted reason, science, equality for all, and optimism, why has it now switched to themes of anti-reason, anti-science, double standards, and cynicism? Explaining Postmodernism is intellectual history with a polemical twist. It provides fresh insight into the debates underlying the furor over political correctness, multiculturalism, and the future of liberal democracy. Stephen Hicks wrote another book that I thought was very good called Nietzsche and the Nazis. Stephen is a professor at Rockford University. He's the author of numerous articles and essays, and we're very proud to have him on the show. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Jordan. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for being on the program. I really appreciate it. So I want to start with this. You're a philosopher, and what would you say at this point is your area of expertise?
Good question. Well, my career has fallen into what seem to be 7-year chunks, where I work on something for 5 years or so, a lot of reading and writing short pieces, and then 2 years on a book, and then I move on to something else. My roots are in kind of epistemology, logic, philosophy of science, but then I've done a great deal of work in kind of modern and contemporary European intellectual history, and then in recent years I've been doing also a lot of work in entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship from a philosophical perspective.
So I noticed that I did a little bit of research, and I noticed that you're also an adherent of Ayn Rand. So this, to me, makes you a very fascinating figure, especially since you're ensconced in the modern American academy, and yet you're a vocal proponent of Ayn Rand and the objectivist philosophy, or at least that is how it appears to me. And, you know, from being a humanities student myself, you can't help but notice that Ayn Rand is somewhat of an exiled figure. You know, she, at least in the humanities disciplines like English and philosophy, she is persona non grata. So how has the modern academy received this interest of yours? And to follow up, do you feel that Ayn Rand has been unfairly maligned in modern scholarship? Is it just an aesthetic sort of aversion to what she stands for? Or is it a lack of understanding regarding her ideas?
Well, I would say all of those things, right, in varying degrees. Probably the most important thing is going to be the politics there. The 20th century among Western intellectuals was dominated by various degrees of leftism, and Rand is a strong proponent of free market and liberal ideas, liberalism taken in a fundamental way. So all of the political vituperation is going to be directed at someone who's on the other side of the spectrum. Now, another component of this is that the academy in the 20th century was professionalizing itself a lot, and Rand was not a professional intellectual. So there's sometimes it comes out in the form of a snobbishness that unless you're a PhD credentialed academic at a institution of higher education, we can't really take you seriously. And certainly writing on you is not going to give one any academic credibility. You can't put it on your CV, right, and so on.
Right.
But at the same time, I do think it's more the politics that's more fundamental because, there's all of the vituperation that's directed at Rand, but that same vituperation was directed at thinkers like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. Everyone will recognize that those guys are geniuses, but they were credentialed academics and Nobel Prize winners and so on. So I think it's a double whammy in the case of Rand. Although I think she also had two other things working against her in terms of reception in the academic world. One is that she was an intellectual warrior, and she, kind of like Nietzsche, whom I know we'll be discussing a little bit later, has kind of a take no prisoners attitude when she's dealing with her intellectual adversaries. People like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek are much more urbane in their rhetorical format. So anybody who comes out swinging, as Rand does often
right.
when they're talking about other actors, is going to get people's backs up and they're going to react a certain way. The other thing I would say is I think you said something about aesthetics right along the way.
Right.
I do think that's an important and understated thing with respect to Rand, because in some ways Rand is greatly out of step with the sensibilities, right, of 20th century intellectuals and academics. She, I don't want to use the word throwback, but she was an heir to the Romantic tradition, right, coming out of the 19th century.
Yeah.
With this kind of high optimism about human progress and the potential of not just outstanding individuals, but people of ordinary capacities to do something special and significant with their lives. And that rubs most of the major 20th century intellectuals, particularly humanities intellectuals, right, the wrong way. For them, they're significantly much more pessimistic. If we just survey the artistic landscape of the 20th century, if you see artists as channeling the humanities zeitgeist, there's a lot of breaking up and pessimism there. It's it's an intellectual culture, right, dominated by political leftism, much of which is very pessimistic and seeing the world as agonistic. Existentialism, with its perceived gloominess and emptiness of life, right, is dominant during Rand's lifetime. And also, you used to have to take major historical events. How does one respond to World War I, followed up fairly closely by the Depression, and then followed up again pretty closely by World War II. So that kind of strong optimism and romanticism that's in Rand does strike many as out of step. So, I think those 4 points will explain a lot.
So let's shift on to postmodernism. I was blown away by your book, Explaining Postmodernism. It was something I found out about from Jordan Peterson, who held your book up and said, "You must read this. You have to read this. It's very important." And
well, thanks to Dr. Peterson.
You start in your book by explaining postmodernism as kind of a reaction to modernism. Can you tell our listeners what is modernism? I thought the summary in your book was incredible. And what is postmodernism? And how are the two philosophies sort of in conflict?
Right. That's a very important question, and we have to scale out, I think, in two dimensions to grasp what's going on. Partly, postmodernism is a philosophical term, and partly it's a historical term. Let's start with the historical term. If you take your standard Western Civ courses, arguments among the historians, but something like the last half millennium or so, 500 years, we are into the modern era. There was a significant number of intellectual and cultural revolutions, right? Revolutions in religion, the rise of humanism, splits between Protestants and Catholics, rise of religious toleration, scientific revolutions, the birth of modern physics, modern chemistry, modern biology, industrial revolution, transformations of invention and engineering, that working with kind of economic and business revolutions where we have mass production and mass logistics and distribution networks and so on, rise of modern capitalism, new forms of finance, stock markets and so on, political revolution. So all of that, right, we can say when we get 200, 300, 400 years ago now, and we look at what's going on in the Western world, it's dramatically different from the way things were 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago. Now, what the postmoderns are saying is that now in our generations, right, the last 40, 50 years, right, or so, we are undergoing an equivalently significant number of revolutions in our own culture. So partly the historical claim is that modernism's culture has run its course, that there's nowhere for it to go, that the course that it has run has resulted in strongly negative pathological outcomes in all of the major dimensions, and what we are seeing now in all of the disruption and the ugliness is the coming to be of a new kind of culture that has to be given a different label, and that will be postmodern.
Well, can you briefly unpack that, because that is one of the claims, the historical political claims that confuses me. What do they mean by modernism has run its course, and how does that square with the reality of the facts in terms of increased lifespan, in terms of childhood mortality declining by something like 49%, in terms of places that, the world poverty rate was virtually cut in half in the past 20 or 30 years. It seems like modernism is doing a pretty good job.
Right. Well, the first issue just is to assess what the postmodern claim is, right? And they are making the claims, right, that in all of the political, economic, social dimensions, things are negative. So the debate, right, over technology, right? One side, of course, the modernists will tell a heroic championing progressive story about technology. The postmoderns come out of the tradition that plays up the downsides, right, of technology. So the first just is, if our question is what is postmodernism? Postmodernism is the claim that modernism has run its course, and when you do all of the assessment of modernism's institutions, you should reach fairly pessimistic conclusions. Now, you're then asking the follow-up question, right, which is the great question, to say, well, how can you possibly be so negative, right, about the modern era, since it also seems, even if you're moderately pessimistic, to at least have had some successes, right? And then we can start running through various successes about poverty rates and life expectancy, right, and so on. So if you don't mind, why don't we put that on the back burner, right, for a little bit, because then we can say, can we assess the legitimacy or the strength of the postmodern critique of modernism? But the other side of your first question, what postmodernism is it's not only a kind of a cultural historical set of claims, but it is a philosophical set of claims. And so the important thing here is, if you focus on the big league postmodern thinkers, right, people like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Lyotard, Richard Rorty, and so on, in my estimation, those are the most powerful strategic thinkers, right, in postmodernism. All of them are philosophers, right, by training, with PhDs in philosophy, and they are staking out positions on all of the major categories of questions that philosophers deal with. So they are making metaphysical or anti-metaphysical claims. They're making epistemological claims. They're making judgments about values and human nature, and then, of course, more broadly about politics, right, and economics. So there, the contrast is between what they took to be the modern philosophical framework. And again, this is very high-level stuff, right? The modern world has many movements and sub-movements, right, that are going on right within it. But if you again survey the last 400 to 500 years, the dominant intellectual framework philosophically is naturalistic, right? We see the physical world as a self-contained world of cause and effect. Mm-hmm. That we study it through the scientific method and various social scientific methods. But individuals use their reason, they gather data, they test hypotheses, and they exercise individual judgment, right, and so forth. So that whole network of philosophical claims, the postmoderns will challenge and say, philosophically, we now think those are untenable. So all of modernity's dominant philosophical positions, the broadly speaking Enlightenment framework intellectually, is just wrong, and we need to reject it in toto, and whatever the future alternatives are, that's what philosophically we need to embrace.
Right. So I was reading a passage in your book, I believe it was by Lyotard, that talked about how Saddam Hussein was a product of the West, just like Hitler and Mussolini, and that these figures are products of Western political institutions, capitalism, and ideas that define the West. And suddenly, reading your book brought me back. It was like Proust's Madeline cookie. It brought me back to Cambrai. I was an undergraduate in philosophy and English, and I had to read Madness and Civilization by Foucault. I had to read Wretched of the Earth by Fanon, Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari, and I think something or other by Lacan. It was all over the curriculum. So I know students are being inundated with this stuff, and I remember my biggest problem with postmodernism at the time was that I realized this is entirely a deconstructionist movement. It doesn't replace modernism or science or reason with anything. And there's a quote in your book by Stanley Fish, who writes, "Deconstruction relieves me of the obligation to be right and demands only that I be interesting." Well, in my view, there's an issue with this, that we have real problems in the world that need to be solved. Not even postmodernists can deny this. They're always bringing up the problems that we have. And we always necessarily use reasoning and facts and logic to solve these problems, as well as the notion of proof, which they seem to be against. So my question is this: what's the end goal of postmodernism? What would the utopia look like? Do postmodern philosophers, critics, professors, do they see their philosophy as being an ultimately productive one, a useful one, a philosophy that is enabling of human flourishing? Or are such notions as usefulness and productivity, are they problematic, is a word that you'll hear over and over again? Are they problematic in themselves? And if their philosophy can't address these things, then why should I care?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting network of observations and questions, right, that you're putting out there. I think the short answer would be to say that there is no end game for the most consistent and ruthless, right, applications of postmodernism. Postmodernism, right, as you're pointing out, is largely negative, right? The language of deconstruction. The language of problematizing everything, seeing everything as a problem. If you push that right to its end limit, then what you say is everything flows, nothing abides. There is no ultimate standard of goodness or ultimate goal toward which we can have progressive aspirations. Instead, the postmodern project just is to point out the futility of all previous attempts in Western and other traditions to try to find some sort of end goal and figure out how to get there. So in that case, they are simply puncturing everyone's balloons, right, in a very deep way, and everything is ultimately going to be deflated. Out of that, then what is going to come? The postmoderns would say, I don't know. Nobody can know. All we can do is just see what happens, right? Western civilization, all of civilization in whatever forms it takes, Western or Eastern, are ultimately going to decline, fail into conflicting pathologies, and we're just along for the ride. Now, that's one answer. I don't think that all postmodernists, right, are in that category. Postmodernism again, is a very broad, right, movement. And just as with modernists, there are several major variants and subvariants and so on. There are variants within postmodernism, right, and subvariants, right. So it's the difference between then saying, there's a big divide between those who are religious and those who are not religious in their understandings, right, of the world. And knowing that someone is religious tells you something significant, right, about them. But then very quickly you get into, well, there are a dozen major religions, right, kicking around, and each of the major religions has a dozen more subvariants, and at some point the subvariations and the things that divide them also become very important.
Right. But unlike religion, I've actually never met a postmodernist that will admit to being a postmodernist. They reject that kind of labeling in the first place, and so there are many people who I would put in that basket, whether or not they will admit it.
And that's a fair point. Partly because when we are using labels like modernism and postmodernism, we're operating at a very high level of abstraction. We're trying to chunk 3 or 4 centuries worth of history and put a big label on it, right? Or we're trying to talk about entire philosophical systems and put big labels on them. But part of the postmodern package is a skepticism about any capacity for human beings to look out at the world and categorize things in certain ways and function accurately at a high level of abstraction to understand, right, what's going on. So they will, while being, right, postmodern, as we would identify them, reject that as a legitimate labeling, right, for what they're doing. But to go back to your question about Leotard and then the follow-up quotation, right, from Fish, right, and so on. Fish, I think, fits better in what we were just talking about before. One reaction to deconstruction and postmodernism is just to say, okay, so there is no truth, there is no objectivity, nobody knows anything, and so forth. So let's just play, right? Let's just be interesting, right? And so the quotation that you mentioned, I no longer have an obligation to be right. I only have an obligation to be interesting. That's representative of kind of a playful response to this and a more aesthetic, right, response to this. We'll just do what's fun, and there's no end game here. We'll just play a game for a while until it's interesting. Then when it stops being interesting, we'll go off and do something else. The quotation from Leotard, we haven't yet talked about the politics, but when he is arguing that Saddam Hussein, right, and so forth, is a product, right, of the West, we're getting an indication there of the strong Marxist, right, or neo-Marxist politicization, right, that's typically part of the postmodern package as well. So there we have Lenin's imperialist theory of history, kind of updated for the end of the 20th century. So, you and I and others, right, we might look at someone like Saddam Hussein and say he is a dictator, a very successful dictator of a certain sort. He actually was kind of national socialist with the theocratic, right, overlay to it, and so we apply standard modernist, right, categories to understanding him. He is a bad guy, right? We are the good guys because we're on the side of freedom and democracy and openness and so forth. And so maybe there's a just war case for deposing this dictator and hoping something better will come out of it. So, but Leotard and the others, right, are arguing that any time in the third world, or in many cases in places in the second world where there's a problem, that you are blaming the victim, right? Anytime you hold them responsible in some way for their problems, that they have this very strong kind of high-level Marxist framework, that it's strong versus weak, oppressor versus oppressed, rich versus weak, and you apply that at the international stage. Then the Lenin contribution is to say, in the rich countries, the rich capitalist countries, they are developing their own internal contradictions and their own internal problems. But one way they disguise that is by exporting all of their problems to the third world. So it's just like, people in the nice rich neighborhoods produce a lot of garbage, but they'll store their garbage in the poor neighborhoods, so it becomes invisible. The rich countries will take all of their garbage, all of their problems, and push them out into the third world nations, making the third world nations even worse. And so therefore, the pathologies are going to rise up in the third world nations, but it's not primarily the third world nations. So Lyotard is saying that someone like Saddam Hussein, right, is, and here we get the oil argument, in an oil-rich country, but the West is all about capitalist control of the oil, and so they are, stirring the pot in the Middle East. And causing the kinds of conditions that make the rise of dictators like Saddam Hussein come up. So again, the West is going to be blamed, right, for the problems in the Middle East, and the target then is critique. Now, that's a long-winded way of getting back to your question about what's the end game. Right, for postmoderns, and one of the answers I said is to say, well, there is no end game, but another kind of end game is to say that the point of all of the deconstruction, the point of the relentless criticism of modernity and of all Western traditions, and the insistence in trying to find clay feet, right, even on its apparent successes. That all of that is a destabilizing move, right, in the service of hoping that out of that destabilization and the mess and chaos that follows, that some sort of cultural leftism will be able to prevail. Right. So if you can't, so to speak, take Western institutions on headlong, right? If you can't say, we have this alternative vision of society, right? Suppose you are some sort of leftist and you can't point out a successful leftist model as a shining example for people to look up to and emulate, but you still, in your heart of hearts, right, want some sort of leftist ideal to prevail, what you need to do then is just destroy, so to speak, the existing apparently successful models, recognize that is going to be very ugly, that there's going to be a lot of brutality and conflict come out of it, but then just hope that your side in that brutal free-for-all will prevail, and the ground will be cleared for you to do your thing.
From this vantage point that you're describing, postmodernism seems not only to be destructive, which it aims to be, as you said, but a little bit immature and trollish, right? It's like the grown-ups at the table are trying to have a serious intellectual discussion, and the kid across the table is sticking his tongue out and kicking people's legs and not engaging. And I don't believe for a moment that when Stanley Fish says that deconstruction means he doesn't have to be right. Only interesting that in his books he's not spending the entire book trying to be right. And another question: how can you deconstruct anything without using reason? How can you have an entire philosophy devoted to tearing down, say, Western philosophical concepts without making arguments based on criteria of soundness and validity?
Yes. On your first point about the kid throwing a temper tantrum, how far down that kind of psychological explanation we can go, that's a very interesting question. I think, again, we would need to take postmoderns as a group and break them down into subgroups, because I think there are some postmoderns who are much more clear-eyed and strategic, right, in their approach. And while they are being deconstructive, they're not doing it in a temper tantrum-y kind of way. I think that would be more characteristic of younger postmoderns, perhaps, intelligent, sensitive young people in their teens, maybe in their early 20s, who they're not fully mature either emotionally, right, or intellectually.
Right, I see what you mean.
But they know enough postmodernism, so to speak, to be dangerous, and that does play into their emotional an intellectual immaturity and does come out in kind of psychologically destructive forms.
But Stephen, I think that the social justice warrior, the younger postmoderns, I don't think that they know they're postmodern. I think that they think they're very, very, very right. I don't think that they have the problem that older postmodern generations had, where the issue was we were worried about moral relativity and things like that. This younger generation, some of them aren't moral relativists. Many of them are just saying, I'm a leftist and I'm right.
Yes.
It's a kind of knee-jerk moral certitude from that leftist worldview.
Yes. And that picks up the second half of your earlier question about how can one be a deconstructionist, right, without deploying rational arguments. And I think that is true of first-generation postmoderns. All of them were very highly educated and sophisticated in their argumentation, well-versed in what was going on in academic philosophy and academic linguistic theory and so forth. And so from their high-level philosophical perspective, I think what they would say is they were deploying reason against itself, right? So you take the reason game seriously with all of its language games, you get inside that system and you tease out its implications, but what they take the end result of that to be is to show that that rational language game is ultimately self-defeating, and they're pointing out the self-defeatingness, right, of it. Now what then happens in subsequent generations is if people say, okay, so reason and rationality and logic and concerns with validity and so forth have been shown to be a fraud or in some sense self-defeating, you would expect in the next generation for people not to learn that skill set, right, as well. So whatever it is that they're doing, right, with their minds is going to be less rational, right, and more something else, right, more emotionalist, right, more physicalist, right, and so forth, until you get to the point where people will have lots of conviction, right, lots of belief and a willingness to act right on their beliefs, but they don't have the intellectual training and the rational argumentation right to justify it. So at this point, and I hope I don't just start to sound like an old guy right at this point, but yes, I am seeing an increasing number of people who are coming out with PhDs. And they are intelligent and clever, right, in one way, but in many respects they are incredibly undereducated, right? They do not know the best arguments for and against on all of the major issues, and they certainly do not know the intellectual history and the cultural history, right, very well,
right?
Because they're now second or third generation postmodernism that says, there's our entire intellectual and cultural traditions that you just don't need to worry yourself about because they've been shown to be fraudulent.
Right.
The more important thing is just to make a certain set of value commitments and to be a kind of semi-intellectual, semi-physicalist activist. And education is a kind of activism, right, in the classroom.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then you're exactly right that the way that comes out is in a kind of absolutism, right? So we might say we're skeptical about reason and its ability to come up with one true narrative about the way the world works, and so all we're stuck with is a plurality of narratives. And then we then say, well, if there's a plurality of narratives and none of them is better justified rationally than any other of them, we have to be kind of relativist and egalitarian with respect to all of those narratives. But that's an inherently unstable position, because each of the people who are inhabiting, right, those narratives, they're human beings. They want to be committed to something. They want their values to be important to them, to live them. But if they're told that they don't need to give a rational justification for them, and it's impossible really to understand somebody else's narrative and to have a debate to see which one is better and worse and to learn from each other, then what seems to make sense is just wholeheartedly to make a commitment to your narrative, to your set of values. Forget the idea that you need to be rational about it. Instead, just take it to the streets and do what you need to advance your positions.
This is sounding like it's explaining this phenomenon that I'm seeing among the younger college generation of saying that when someone disagrees with you politically, that they are invalidating you, that they are invalidating your existence. If someone doesn't believe in affirmative action, they are invalidating you, and that words are violence.
Sure, that's right. Part of that, I think, is psychologically true. If whatever you believe, if you know that you don't have arguments for it, right, that somehow you've just been born into a certain framework, you've been acculturated to it, and you weren't in control of that process, then the situation you're in is that you've got a strongly held set of beliefs that form your identity, and that really matters to you, but at the same time, you know that you're not in control of your identity. And that is a somewhat destabilized internal position to be psychologically. So anybody who does come along from another perspective and seems to have good facts and good arguments against something that you take to be important to your identity, that person is going to be a threat to you, right? Because you know that you don't have facts and arguments to defend who you are and to respond to that person. So in self-defense, right, what you will need is to find some way to not have to respond to that person, to take that person's criticisms and then just reject them. So, being able to say that, well, you're just coming from an alien perspective, you're attacking my perspective, you're attacking my identity, and you shouldn't do that, right? That enables you just to dismiss, right, all criticisms, and to bracket the person's objections, right, and throw them away. So, right, words as violence, right, the second part of your question there as well, right. Part of the whole postmodern package is to say that language, right, is not a cognitive tool in the modernist sense, right. It's not about getting the world right, coming up with category schemes that reflect the features of the natural world. It's not a set of tools that we then use to communicate ideas so that we find ways to adjust how you're parsing the world out and make it fit with the way I'm parsing the world out so that we get on the same page, right, metaphorically speaking. Language is not cognitive in that sense. If we are deeply skeptical, then we have to recast what we're doing, right, when we are using language, using words, right, and so forth. So language then is not a tool of cognition, right? Language is something else. It's merely a rhetorical tool. It's a tool that we use to try to influence other people, that other people try to use to influence us, but without any of that cognitive, right, stuff, right, that's going on. If you add to that, right, the idea that human relations are fundamentally conflictual, right, that your group's identity, right, your gender identity, your racial, ethnic, political identity, and so forth, and mine are in conflict with each other, then what that means is that language in our social intercourse with each other is a tool for dealing with that conflict, right? So it's a tool, kind of like a weapon, right? Just as you use weapons in physical conflict to manage your disagreements with other groups, language then is a weapon, right, that we will use in our conflicts, right, with other groups. So, yeah, language does amount to a kind of violence, but then it's just a matter of who gets to use the violent weapons, and it becomes a power struggle to control who gets to say what words under what circumstances.
And the ironic thing about this is that in the absence of these word weapons that we're describing, all there is violence. So if you can't solve problems through speech, the only thing that you have left is violence. And I wonder if they've fully reckoned with that fact.
Right. Well, absolutely. Because then, right, when you get down to practical politics, words have a certain amount of power, and you can go some distance down the road, particularly with younger people, by manipulating their linguistic framework and their cognitive framework. But at a certain point, you say, all right, this is not the most powerful weapon we have at our disposal. And if you are very skeptical, then you're going to say, at a certain point, it's kind of pointless to try to reason and converse with people. Why don't we just go for the more powerful weapons, right? Get the sticks out, get the guns out, start using our fists. And if we have the advantage of numbers, we can prevail in the streets.
So just to touch back on what you said earlier about Marxism, you were talking about, the postmodern worldview as being one of, a kind of battleground, a sort of a power struggle. Jordan Peterson claims, and this is something that I'm kind of stuck on, he claims that postmodernism is a post-Marxist sleight of hand. This is an argument that he makes frequently. He says that the old Marxism rejected individualism, obviously capitalism, and saw the world as basically a battleground between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which is obviously true. And that this argument failed to hold any sway in the at the end of the 20th century, given everything that had happened, the catastrophes of communism and socialism. And that Marxists performed a sleight of hand when that wasn't working out somewhere around the 70s and said, okay, if it's not the poor against the rich, we'll make it the oppressed versus the oppressor. Is that really true, Stephen, what Dr. Peterson is saying? Are postmodernism and Marxism really one and the same philosophy? Do they share the same foundation? I know very little, I'll be honest, about Marxist theory. But weren't the old Marxists dialectical materialists? Didn't they believe in science and physical laws and evolution in the material world?
All right. Again, a very interesting set of observations, and partly it's a mixture of your gloss on Jordan Peterson's take, and then a little bit of yours toward the end of that. Let me say, I think it's wrong to identify postmodernism with Marxism or even with neo-Marxism. Postmodernism is broader, and here again, you do have to start fairly quickly, breaking things down. Just as we would say with Christianity, fairly quickly there are several versions of Christianity. There's Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, and so on. Not all postmoderns, are Marxist or even neo-Marxists. There is a significant strain of postmoderns who take the metaphysical or the anti-metaphysical material seriously. They take the anti-reason and then pro-skepticism, relativism seriously, and they downplay any normative side of postmodernism at all. So they would say the important thing about modernism is its metaphysical naturalism and its epistemological empiricism and rationalism. Those are all failures, and that's all that we mean by postmodernism. The value implications of that are entirely open. If you are skeptical about everything, if you are anti-realistic about everything, that includes being skeptical and anti-realistic about values. So there is no one value framework, including Marxism, that is the appropriate implication, that comes out of our postmodernism. Now, that said, there are nonetheless a significant number, and I would say a majority, of postmoderns of the last 2 or 3 generations for whom the postmodernism does work with a kind of Marxism/neo-Marxism, and so forth. Now, the 1970s, you mentioned that date. I don't know if that's your date or
that's
Jordan
Dr. Peterson's date.
Okay, that date. I think the evolution starts a lot earlier. Already by the 1890s, I would say you found a large number of Marxists who were academics and intellectuals who had said, already 50 years earlier, Marx and Engels had made the predictions about how capitalism's internal contradictions were going to realize themselves, bourgeoisie versus proletariat, rise of a revolutionary class, right, and so on. And that's not happening. And already the social science indicators are that society is not moving in the directions that classical Marxist theory says. So we need to rethink what Marxism is all about. And one of the things that they started to argue was, and you start to see this in the 1890s, the first generation of the 20th century, 1910s, 1920s, is to say that maybe we need to not be as reductively materialistic, particularly about economic matters, as classical Marxism is, that we need to broaden the Marxist oppressor versus oppressed framework to start to include other cultural variables, right? So at that point, Marxism is evolving into a broader cultural right Marxism. Now things get kind of interrupted by World War I, right, and everybody is focused on different things, but when intellectual activity picks up again after World War I, you start to see the rise of the Frankfurt School.
Right.
And so they are very important, 20s, 30s, right, and 40s. And what they're doing is a number of things, but partly merging classical Marxism with Freudianism, and arguing that we need a much more sophisticated psychological theory, and certainly a much more sophisticated social psychological theory, so that it's not just economic, materialistic forces, right? That human psychology has those same oppressor versus oppressed dynamics, that instead of talking only about oppression, we need to talk about repression, and the internal things, right, that go on inside the human psychology. And that, again, it's not just economics. Then by the 1950s, right, in the 1960s, you start to see, right, race versions, right, racial versions, ethnic versions, gender versions, environmental versions. At a high level of abstraction, they are retaining the classical Marxist language of exploitation, right, and oppression, but it is much more nuanced and much more wide-ranging in the cultural dimensions. So at that point, the old left is done. We're into the new left. Postmodernism's first generation's intellectuals, Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, Rorty, and so forth, they are on the ascendancy. So I would say the intellectual groundwork has been long laid before we get to the 1970s.
Okay.
But what is true is in the 1970s is that there is, particularly after 1968, which was very important, particularly for the European intellectuals, important for the American intellectuals, but less so. After 1968, there is then again a rethinking about what left strategy is going to do, and so we do see, again, another significant shift occurring in the 1970s, and I think that's what Jordan Peterson is picking up on importantly.
Okay. So I want to talk now about the Western canon and postmodernism's rejection of the Western intellectual tradition. I was talking to Mark Bauerlein a few weeks ago. He's an Emory professor, and he was telling me that he had lunch with Lyotard. And at this lunch, Lyotard was stressing the importance of reading figures like Francis Fukuyama, who is like a neocon, and also of reading the Western classics. Other of the old guard postmodernists like Foucault and even Marcuse, they basically said you've got to read the Western classics if you're going to go about deconstructing them. Foucault apparently even recommended reading Friedrich Hayek. But this, I don't think, is happening anymore. The stress on reading the classics and the importance of reading the classics and teaching them in a way that is non-vindictive. Okay, so some postmodern professors have to teach the classics. It's a requirement for certain degrees. But I get the sense that it's being de-emphasized. Why is this happening? Why did the older postmodernists favor reading the classics? and why aren't we reading the classics anymore in our humanities departments?
All right, that's a great set of questions there. I think we could go off in 4 very interesting sub-discussions here. One about the Western tradition as a whole and the rejection of the Western tradition, Lyotard and his insistence on reading it, Foucault's interest in Hayek and perhaps flirtations with neoliberalism, and then your nice point about even though earlier big-name postmodernists are saying we have to engage with the Western tradition, that you don't see that happening. Instead, you get, hey-ho, Western civ has got to go among our generation, right, and so on. Let me say a couple of things here, right, initially. Lyotard in particular, I guess maybe true confessions here. My view is that of all of the postmoderns, he is perhaps the deepest, right, of them philosophically. My only reservation here would be Richard Rorty and the depth of his understanding of the analytic tradition is also extraordinarily, right, impressive. Mm-hmm. This is a very fine-grained judgment about 2 superlative intellects. But my sense is that Lyotard is perhaps the deepest read in all of the traditions and the one who is most fundamental, right, on all of them. I think particularly if one is at all interested in aesthetic theory and understanding why art, the art world broadly speaking, has gone the way that it has gone, Lyotard's reading of Kant and the post-Kantian traditions, particularly Kant's understanding of the sublime, is very powerful. And I'm struck by that in part because also in my book, the Explaining Postmodernism book, I place big importance, controversial importance on Kant as a significant turning point.
So if they've read Kant, that's what I don't understand here, is that how they arrived at the conclusions that they have if they read Kant. Like, for Kant, even though human reason can't truly comprehend or know things in themselves, to use Kant's language, things are out there in the world still. At the end of the day, we have perceptions of these things, and we use these perceptions to make judgments, and we can make valid judgments. And the material world is still out there, even if we can't know it from its own side, to use a Buddhist phrase. How are they positing this? And how are they arriving at this conclusion, having read Kant?
Right. So I'm going to actually bracket that. That's an important question. I think that's your 4th right point about how we can be postmodern or be whatever it is, having read Kant or not necessarily having read Kant. So I was just wanting to at that point give some props to Lyotard, because we hear a lot about Foucault and Derrida and so on. But I would recommend that people who are most deeply interested in understanding postmodernism to kind of elevate Lyotard a little bit more. As much as I disagree fundamentally with Lyotard, you're also interestingly pointing about Foucault, and I do have a soft spot for much of that's overstated, for a significant amount of Foucault. One thing that is important about him is that he did evolve significantly, 50s, 60s, 70s, and on into the early 80s, when he died. And as you were pointing out, toward the end of his life, he did engage seriously with a thinker like Friedrich Hayek, Nobel Prize winner in economics, and more broadly a very deep social philosopher as well. So Foucault, coming out of the French left, and in some cases the pretty far French left and hard French left, his willingness and open-mindedness to other cultural traditions and intellectual traditions such as Hayekian liberalism, that does say something about the cast of his mind. And that feeds in again to your other question, why do we not find that same cast of mind in this generation, right, of postmodern thinkers? It seems unimaginable, right, for them to engage seriously with Kant or with Hayek or anybody in the tradition. But let's back up and start with your first question about the Western tradition and the postmodern rejection, right, of the Western tradition. I don't think that's true. I think a better way to put it is to say that postmodernism represents a selective rejection of some elements, right, of the Western tradition. And to put it positively, I think a better way to put it is to say that postmodernism, despite its protestations, is in fact part of the Western tradition, and it represents in my view, a pathological end result, right, of some traditions that are homegrown, right, within Western intellectual and cultural traditions. So that then is to say, if you say, for example, in the case of Lyotard is well read in Kant, right, and he's tracing certain developments, right, that come out of that. Well, Kant is a part of the now classical Western tradition. If you want to make connections of postmodernism to Marxism and neo-Marxism and cultural Marxism, well, Marx is squarely, right, a part of the Western tradition. If you want to talk about someone like Stanley Fish, right, and his kind of rhetorical sophistry, right, well, when you push things way back to the Greeks, right, the sophists, right, and everything that they represent, that persistent strain of relativity and skepticism about various things, is now also a persistent, right, part of the Western tradition now for 2,600 years, right, or more. So postmodernism, I think, amounts to a contemporary repackaging and a very sophisticated working out of some elements that are native to the Western tradition and a critique of what they take to be other parts, right, of the Western tradition. So if we talk about the Western tradition, for example, it's natural, particularly in philosophy, for us to go back to the Greeks. And one slightly cartoonish, but nonetheless powerful way of understanding Greek intellectual life is to say that everything is an intellectual battle between the Platonists and the Aristotelians. Now, I don't think that's quite true, but there is some power there to say, all right, we are interested in truth, but where do we find truth, right? And so the Aristotelians are broadly naturalistic and scientific in their approach, right? The world is cause and effect through the power of empirical reason. We can understand the way the world works. The Platonists then say, well, no, the natural world left to its own devices is going to be ultimately chaotic and acausal, and if we're going to try to understand why there is order and causality in the world, we need to leave the natural world and go to a supernatural world, a world of forms. That's where we find timeless, eternal truths that are in some sense imposed right on the natural world. So you have a broadly naturalistic versus naturalistic approach, but both of them are believing that there is truth and there is ultimately right order right in the world. Now you can push that, if you push certain forms of Platonism, if you're going to really understand the higher world, how far can reason and logical argument take us in understanding it? And maybe the Platonists will say, well, ultimately there has to be some sort of mystical insight or revelation that is visited upon one. And then the pro-reason people will say, no, there is no mysticism, right, and so on. So we have a broadly empirical reason versus kind of mystical faith insight debate that is also characteristic. Now, that twofold debate. You can explain a lot of the Western intellectual tradition then in terms of a debate between the Platonists and the Aristotelians, right? The naturalists, and I'm reversing my order, right? The supernaturalists and the naturalists, right? The mystical faith tradition and the empirical reason tradition, right? And so forth. But if we go back to the Greeks, it is important that an important part of Greek intellectual life was the skeptical tradition as well. And that was homegrown. So you had the sophists, Protagoras, Gorgias,
right.
A crude sophist,
right.
In Plato's Republic early on, Thrasymachus, representing a very formidable challenge to Socrates, and through him to Plato as well. So I think a better way to understand the Western tradition is to see it in terms of an ongoing three-way debate. Right? So you have, on the one hand, metaphysically, right, those who will argue that we should understand the natural world as having kind of causality built into it, and those who say no, that causality is imposed upon the natural world by a higher world that is actually the source of order and principles. And then the third tradition that argues against both of them, to say that in fact there is no ultimate causality and order. Instead we have a flux, an ultimate chaos, right? Kind of represented in a Heraclitean tradition, right, and so forth. Or epistemologically, right, between those who say ultimately if we want to know the truth we need to turn to some sort of mystical revelation and have faith, right, in mystical revelations, right, versus those who say no, if we ultimately want to know the truth we need to do the hard work of empiricism and mathematical logic and scientific method. But then against both of those, a third epistemological tradition that says there is no truth, we are ultimately ignorant, and skepticism and the outgrowths of that rule. So if you characterize things in that three-way tradition, then postmodernism, now jumping 2,500 years right to the present day, is not alien to the Western tradition. Instead, what it is a modern repackaging, a sophisticated version of that
sophism,
earlier
sophistry.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Right.
So when they say that they are anti-metaphysical and they're rejecting rather the Western tradition, right? What they are doing is rejecting Platonism, and they are rejecting Aristotelianism, right? Or they are rejecting naturalism and supernaturalism, right? Or they are rejecting both the claims of mysticism and faith and the claims of empirical rationalism. So
would you say that what is happening now, this sort of, I think there's a new branch that is extending out, this tendency of critiquing the West based on the fact that the works of the Western canon do not meet our 21st century progressive standards of equity and propriety. Is that an outgrowth of postmodernism? Is that seems to be the dominant rejection of the Western canon on campuses today, that it just shouldn't be read because it's in a sense dangerous. You need a trigger warning on it.
Yes. So, right. So all of that, I think, it's a rhetorical strategy. It's part of a power play among second or third generation, right, postmoderns, right, of our generation. Because then if you talk about the Western tradition the way that you and I have just been talking about it, you say, well, look, that whole Platonic tradition has a lot of very powerful defenders, as does the Aristotelian tradition, and that the only way then to defend your version of what ultimately is the right set of values is to take on the entire Western tradition. And my sense is that the vast majority of young people who are activist-minded, they don't want to do that much intellectual work. Right? They're going to take their initial course, start reading Plato and Augustine and Aquinas and people in the various other traditions, say, wow, these guys are really brilliant. What are the chances that I'm going to be able to outthink them and outsmart them and then convince a number of people of the right philosophical framework, right, and so on. I want a shortcut. They know they're cheating, but many people are not that intellectually honest, and they're willing to take various shortcuts to advance, right, whatever their agenda is. So, but at the same time, they are, as younger people now, third generation, hearing from their professors, right, who are now going to be, right, mid-career, that they don't have to, right, take on, right, that tradition, right, because part then of the Western tradition has been to say that if you are going to be intellectually honest, right, methodologically, right, what you need to do is understand the best arguments on all sides of various controversial debates.
Mill's advice. You need to take Mill's advice.
Exactly.
He who knows only his own side knows little of that.
Perfectly said. Right. Chapter 2 of On Liberty. One of the great classic statements of what a liberal education, right, really consists in. And Mill, in that sense, is an optimist, right, in saying that if we do that hard work, and we actually have to do the hard work if we still believe in truth, that's the only way ultimately to do it. And teachers and professors actually have a very deep moral responsibility, right, not to put their thumbs on the scale too much, simply to indoctrinate students. Instead, the teacher's fundamental responsibility is to educate students in the best, right, of the traditions, the arguments on both sides, and then ultimately train the individual student's capacity for exercising individual judgment for himself, right, or herself. Now, all of that then goes away by the time we get to second generation postmoderns, because they don't believe in debate and reason as ultimately progressive, right? They don't believe in it philosophically, but then, as you were just saying about 3 minutes ago, they ultimately, many of them have value commitments of their own, and when they look at what has gone on, partly, or say, kind of first historically in Western civilization, but what now seems to be increasingly a global civilization, is that the dominant traditions now, or the traditions that have most prevailed coming out of the West, have been very successful in some regards. Some of the things you were starting to talk about earlier, right? We do now have more democracy, right? More liberalism,
less slavery, more
slavery,
women's rights.
Right. That's right. And all of that, right, came out of a strong individualism, right? That all human beings, and a universalism, right? All human beings, no matter what their economic background, no matter what their color of their skin, no matter what their ethnicity or religious orientation, no matter what their sex or gender, all human beings have certain inalienable, right, human rights, life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, that all individuals have the capacity for reason, and so we can trust them, and we should train that capacity for reason by making everyone literate and making sure that they get a good education.
The American Creed.
Exactly, that's right. Now, within the American creed, or broadly, more speaking, within the Western European tradition, and then more broadly now just global civilization, we can have a debate, right, about whether some sort of Platonic / Judeo-Christian, right, understanding of where those firm universalistic principles come from, or whether it's a much more naturalistic, kind of Aristotelian, Lockean, Hobbesian understanding that is the source of that. Right. But what both of those sides have in common, right, is the idea that there are universal principles, that we do have to respect the individual and have certain rights and so forth. And that tradition, or that conjoining, right, of those two sub-traditions within the Western tradition has been very, right, successful. And so if, right, you are committed, right, to a different tradition, right, you want to be some sort of Marxist, or you want to be some sort of Rousseauian, or some sort of updated version of leftism, then you have to, right, find some way to reject the successes of the Western intellectual traditions and the Western cultural traditions.
I wonder if you read Edward Herman's book, The Cave in the Light,
I've not.
Based on everything that you've been talking about, that would be one that I would recommend to my listeners. I want to touch on one last thing, Professor Hicks. Sure. Postmodernism's criticism of science. I remember I watched a YouTube video of Richard Dawkins, who came out against the postmodern abuses of science, and he was talking about the feminist philosopher Luce Irigaray, who claimed that Newton's Principia is a rape manual. She argued that E equals mc squared was a sexed equation, in that it privileges the speed of light and all of this stuff. That fluid mechanics is being oppressed by more masculine physics. This can't be real. Is this real, Stephen? Is this part of the postmodern ethos right now?
It is, although I believe Luce Irigaray, the E equals mc squared and privileging the speed of light, that part is correct. I think the Newton's Principia being a rape manual, I believe that should be ascribed to Sandra Harding. But that of course is a detail, and your broader question is about postmodernism's attitude right towards science and the offshoots right of science and so on. I think it's right to say that for the postmoderns, science is just one more narrative, and the same deconstruction of all narratives is going to be applied to science. You do find this coming out in a variety of forms. Some people will note that it's been mostly white people, right, historically, who first institutionalized science. So you'll have racialist versions of postmodernism that will criticize science for being just a white way of thinking, right? Or kind of feminist postmoderns will argue that since most of the work has been done by males historically, and they might conjoin that with what really sounds like old-fashioned crude sexism. That males are more rational and logical, and females are more emotional and empathetic. That privileging scientific method is unfair and sexist, right, and so on. You find in ethnocentric versions of postmodernism the idea that science is European primarily in origin, but what about African ways of knowing, or Asian ways of knowing, or Native American ways of knowing, and so forth. So the idea then is going to be, again, the creek that science puts itself forth as not only a narrative, right, but ultimately one true, right, narrative that should hold ultimately for all human beings. The skepticism and relativism that comes out of postmodernism naturally is going to put it at odds, right, with that. Now, again, people outside of various Western traditions can want to uphold their traditions against what seems to be a very successful, scientifically based model. But the most powerful arguments against science's universalist pretenses, right, from the postmodern perspective, are again internal to the Western tradition. Here, Thomas Kuhn is very important. I know there are lots of people who like Kuhn and give him what I think of as a softer interpretation. I think if you just read Kuhn as a historian of scientist or of science, or as a sociologist of science, then he's very perceptive and does a lot of very good work. But in his more philosophical moments, he does explicitly say that we have to reject the notion of truth and the idea that science helps us get closer to the truth. And he does undercut explicitly, right, any notion of science being progressive.
Even a priori truths? Do we have to reject the truth of 2 + 2 = 4?
Yes. And there are
good luck with that.
There are good internal to the Western traditional understandings, right, of epistemological. That's turning into a noun pileup. Broadly epistemological concerns, right, narrower understandings of where we get our concepts from, and then sophisticated arguments about philosophy of language and semantics that lead one to skeptical objections to even 2 + 2 = 4. And Thomas Kuhn, right, again, getting his education, first-rate history of science and philosophy of education in the 40s and 50s. By the time he writes in the early 1960s, the structure of scientific revolutions, right, is drawing on all of those traditions and precisely saying, if we understand the history of science properly and the philosophy of science properly, we have to bracket and set aside the notions of truth, fact, right, logic as being realistic, and progress. And it's not accidental then that the next generations of postmodern thinkers take Thomas Kuhn and cite him and run with that ball very far down the football field, right, so to speak. It's also important, again, to say that this is within the Western intellectual tradition and not alien to it. Paul Feyerabend, writing, again, someone who is very sophisticatedly educated within analytic philosophy, knowing very well the ins and outs of Karl Popper's more science-friendly tradition, arguing again and concluding by the time we get to the 1960s that yes, science is a very powerful narrative, right? But it is just one more narrative, and we have no good basis for thinking that science's narrative is any better than witchcraft's narratives, right? Or magical thinking's, right? Narratives, right? And so forth. They are all just narratives. So yes, science is bracketed. Now, if you then conjoin science as just being one narrative, but somehow it has become a very powerful narrative, you can join that with the entire power narrative that power necessarily is zero-sum. The strong always use their narrative at the expense of the weak. Then you are going to say whites, males, Europeans, and so forth are just using this scientific narrative to oppress non-whites, non-males, non-Europeans, and then all of the pathological forms of postmodern anti-science come out in the second and third generation.
But it isn't zero-sum.
Okay, so then we go back right to your response to the very first question. What do we say to the actual data, if we're allowed to use the language of actual data, right? That seems to show that, in fact, right, it's not zero-sum, that, in fact, science and liberalism and the other traditions initially coming out of Westernism and now being exported and happily imported to other parts of the world are, in fact, improving the human condition. And so here I would say yes. The postmoderns, by the time we get into our generation, have to willfully blind themselves to the data. Right? Life expectancy has improved immeasurably.
Violence has gone down.
Violence has gone down. It's a beautiful thing. The halving of the poverty rates, whether you're talking about extreme poverty or more relative versions, right, of poverty. The modest openness of China and India to Westernism over the course of the last 2 generations now, and lifting, and now I believe the number is over 700 million people out of extreme poverty. That is that's awesome. The fact that Western women first now enjoy freedoms, incredibly progressive, right, on getting rid of slavery are genuine achievements, right? So I do think there is a moral fault to all of those postmoderns in our generation who, to my extent, are willfully not paying attention to the data. They are inside an intellectual bubble, and they are not willing to look outside of that intellectual bubble. And unfortunately, I think one of the things that we do have to say is that we know that one of the things that's true about human psychology is, particularly when one is young, it's very easy to get yourself committed to a normative framework, and then to hold on to that normative framework in a very strongly faithful fashion. to blind yourself, right? Blind faith is a powerful psychological mechanism to seal yourself off to any other reasonable position, to not be willing to take criticisms of your own position, to be willing to say, yeah, even though those other guys, I disagree with them, they can be decent human beings with good arguments for their position, to be willing actually to sit down and look at some data, look at some graph, learn some statistics, study some other cultures, actually learn the history and to realize how bad the bad old days were. If you're not actually willing to do that, I do think that's a moral failing. And we do now have a dominant intellectual framework in Western intellectual and life ensconced in the humanities that is encouraging a large number of young people to adopt precisely that pathological psychological framework.
Oh, that's a great reminder and an excellent way to wrap up our conversation. Professor Hicks, I really appreciate you spending the time with me today. And is there anything that you want to notify my listeners about, whether it's something that you're working on or a special work of the Western canon that is close to your heart?
Well, yes, I'm working on that, on a few projects right now, but my big writing project is the follow-up book to the Explaining Postmodernism. That's mostly a negative work. It's an intellectual history of postmodernism, but on my view, it's pathological, and I don't argue the positive. So that's what I'm working on now. No, what I would say is nothing that's too original, but do take John Stuart Mill's advice. People have wide-ranging interests. Do follow your own interests. But people who are in the Western tradition, who are the big names, make sure you know something about them. Engage with their arguments. If you're not getting a good classically liberal education from your professors and in your own reading, go out of your way to identify who the important names in history that one should know. And give yourself a good education. That's the long-term health for yourself as an individual, and certainly it's the long-term health of civilization.
Well, that's fantastic advice, and thank you again. And I hope you'll consider coming on when we talk about the Enlightenment thinkers. That'll be probably years down the road at this rate. So
yeah, absolutely. Happy to spend time with you again. It was a good conversation. Yeah, the Western tradition, there are some thinkers we can engage with more. I know you're interested in Nietzsche. Maybe we can have a good conversation.
That would be perfect.
We'll have a conversation about Nietzsche too.
Sounds great.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye-bye. Okay, that's it for this month's show. I'd like to say a special thanks to Daniel Mendelsohn and his publishers. Be sure to get your hands on a copy of his book, An Odyssey. And also thank you again to Stephen Hicks. Buy his book, Explaining Postmodernism. And stay tuned next month for episode 4 of the Western Canon Podcast. We'll be talking in greater depth about the themes, the ideas, the history, and the influence of Homer's Odyssey. We'll really get into it. We'll get beyond the summary, and we'll talk in great depth about why Homer's Odyssey matters and what it's saying in a deeper sense. We'll talk about fathers and sons. We'll talk about Xenia. We'll talk about Star Trek and culture. And of course, we'll be checking in with our Western Canon correspondent, Gina Santiago, along with another notable guest. Again, I'm Jordan Alexander Hill. Thanks for listening and happy reading.